Some messages don't arrive loudly. They come quietly, almost gently, and yet everything after them is different. That's the sense I keep returning to when I read about Archangel Gabriel. Not a figure surrounded by constant presence, but one who appears at very specific moments, when something is about to be revealed, not gradually, but with clarity that doesn't leave much room for uncertainty. The first time I really slowed down and followed those moments, I noticed how little is actually said about him directly. There's no extended description, no detailed introduction. Instead, he's known almost entirely through what he delivers. In the book of Daniel, his presence is tied to understanding, visions that are difficult to grasp at first, then carefully explained. I remember reading those passages and realizing how measured everything feels. Nothing rushed, nothing overwhelming, just a steady unfolding of meaning. And then, much later, in the Gospel of Luke, the setting changes completely. The scale becomes smaller, more personal. A quiet moment, a direct message, delivered not to a crowd or a kingdom, but to an individual. And yet, what's spoken in that moment carries consequences far beyond what could be seen right away. That contrast stayed with me, because whether the message is given in a vision or in stillness, the tone doesn't change. There's a consistency to it, something calm, precise, and certain, not forceful, not dramatic in the way we might expect, just clear. As I sat with these passages longer, I began to notice how different this kind of presence feels compared to others. It's not about action or conflict. It's about revelation, about moments where something hidden becomes known, even if it's not fully understood yet. And maybe that's why the appearances are so brief. They don't linger, because they don't need to. So tonight, I want to move through these moments slowly, not focusing only on what was said, but on how it was delivered and what it might have felt like to receive something like that. Unexpected, direct, and impossible to ignore. We'll stay with each scene a little longer than usual, allowing the stillness around it to become part of the story. You don't need to analyze every detail or connect every piece. You can just listen and let the words settle at their own pace. And if your thoughts begin to quiet as we go, if the story softens into something more distant, then just let that happen. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your breathing slow and allow everything around you to fade into a quieter space. If this kind of calm, reflective journey through moments of quiet revelation helps you rest, you can stay with me. We'll follow the path of these messages carefully and let them unfold one at a time. There is something about the quiet of night that makes ancient stories feel closer. When the world slows down and the noise fades, we find ourselves more open to things that are old and deep and true. Tonight, I want to sit with you in that stillness and tell you the story of one of the most remarkable figures in all of religious history, a being whose name has been spoken across thousands of years, in dozens of languages, by billions of people. His name is Gabriel. You may have heard it in a church, or a synagogue, or a mosque, or perhaps simply in a piece of music that moved you without your quite knowing why. But I wonder if you have ever stopped to ask what that name actually means, where it comes from, and what the ancient texts really say about the one who carries it. That is exactly where I want to begin tonight, because the name itself tells us something extraordinary before Gabriel ever speaks a single word. So let me take you back to the oldest layers of the biblical text, and let us discover together who this messenger really is. Let us start with the name, because in the ancient Hebrew world, names were never accidental. They were declarations, announcements, even prophecies spoken over a life or a being at the moment of their first appearance in the story. The name Gabriel comes from the Hebrew Gavriel, written in the Hebrew letters as Gabriel, and when you break it apart, two roots emerge clearly. The first part, Gavri, connects to the Hebrew word for strength or might. The second part, El, is one of the oldest and most sacred words in the Hebrew language. It simply means God. Put them together and you get something like God is my strength, or strong man of God. I find it remarkable that this is not merely a title assigned to Gabriel by later tradition or by the imagination of theologians. It is built directly into his name, encoded there in the oldest linguistic layers of the text. Every time someone calls out the name Gabriel, they are, whether they know it or not, speaking a small declaration about the nature of divine power. The Hebrew scholar Ludwig Köhler, in his landmark Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, confirms this pattern, noting that the suffix El is what scholars call a theophoric element, a piece of a name that carries the identity of God within it. So Gabriel does not merely serve God. His very name announces that God is the source of whatever strength he carries. Now here is something that surprises many people when they first encounter it. Despite how famous Gabriel is, despite how central he is to Christmas stories and church paintings and religious traditions across the world, he is named only 4 times in the entire canonical Bible. 4 times. That is it. 2 of those appearances are in the Old Testament, in the book of Daniel. 2 are in the New Testament, in the Gospel of Luke. And those are the only places in the Protestant biblical canon where you will find the name Gabriel written. He also appears in the Catholic and Orthodox books of Tobit, where the angel Raphael is named. But Gabriel himself is not the focus there. What this means is that the enormous tradition built around Gabriel, all the art and theology and devotion and storytelling, rests on a remarkably small number of original textual moments. I think that is worth sitting with for a second, because it tells us something about the power of these appearances. Each time Gabriel shows up in Scripture, something so significant happens, something so world-altering unfolds, that those 4 brief appearances have shaped the spiritual imagination of humanity for over 2,000 years. There is another detail about Gabriel that catches people off guard, and I want to be honest with you about it, rather than gloss over it the way popular retellings often do. Gabriel is not called an archangel in the Protestant biblical canon. That title, archangel, appears in the New Testament, but it is applied specifically and only to Michael in the letter of Jude, chapter 1, verse 9, where Michael is called the archangel. Gabriel never receives that formal designation in the canonical biblical text. The title of archangel attached to Gabriel comes primarily from extra-canonical tradition, from writings outside the Protestant Bible, from early Jewish and Christian literature that expanded the angelic hierarchy in remarkable ways. Now, the Catholic and Orthodox traditions do recognize Gabriel as an archangel, and we will explore why that is as our story unfolds across these chapters. But I think it matters to be clear about what the text actually says versus what tradition has added. Not because tradition is unimportant, it is deeply important, but because the truth is always richer when we know exactly where each piece of information comes from. Gabriel's standing in religious history does not depend on a title. What he does speaks far more powerfully than any rank ever could. So where does Gabriel first appear? The oldest biblical record of Gabriel places him in one of the most dramatic and disturbing visionary experiences in all of Scripture, the book of Daniel. And before I take you there, let me say a word about what makes Gabriel remarkable, even as terrible machinery of ancient empires. In a text full of kings Gabriel arrives as something entirely different, a being of clarity in a world of confusion, a voice of understanding in a moment of overwhelming vision. The prophet Daniel, living as a captive in Babylon, is receiving visions that terrify him to the core of his being. He sees empires rise and fall in symbolic form. He sees a ram and a great goat colliding with world-shaking force. And in the middle of this overwhelming experience, a voice calls out from between the banks of the Ulai River, the Ulai Canal, a real waterway near the ancient city of Susa in what is now modern Iran. And that voice gives Gabriel a specific command. It says, in the words of Daniel, chapter 8, verse 16, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." Those are the first words ever spoken to Gabriel in the biblical record. And they tell us everything about his function. He is sent not to destroy, not to protect, not to fight. He is sent to help a human being understand. What happens next in Daniel chapter 8 is something I want you to picture clearly, because the text does not soften it. When Gabriel approaches Daniel, Daniel does not feel a warm, comforting presence. He falls on his face in terror. The text in Daniel chapter 8, verse 17, says Daniel was terrified and fell prostrate. Gabriel reaches out and raises him up and then speaks to him. But the vision is so overwhelming that Daniel becomes ill after Gabriel leaves. He lies sick for days. This is not the gentle, reassuring angel of greeting cards. This is a being whose very approach causes a grown man, a man of deep faith and courage, to collapse to the ground. And yet, even in this terrifying encounter, Gabriel's purpose is entirely oriented toward understanding and communication. He explains the vision methodically. The ram, he tells Daniel, represents the kingdoms of Media and Persia. The great goat represents Greece. He speaks of kings and of a time he calls the time of the end. I find something deeply meaningful in the contrast here. This being of such overwhelming presence, channeling all of that power into the act of making things clear to one frightened human being, lying face down on the ground. Now, alongside the canonical book of Daniel, I want to share something from outside the Protestant Bible, because it gives us a fascinating window into how ancient Jewish communities thought about Gabriel in the centuries surrounding the writing of the New Testament. The book of 1st Enoch, which is not part of the Protestant or Catholic biblical canon, but is considered canonical scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, and was clearly circulating among early Jewish communities, describes Gabriel in terms that go far beyond what Daniel records. 1st Enoch chapter 9 lists Gabriel alongside 3 other angels, Michael, Sarachael, and Uriel, as 4 great presences who stand closest to God's throne. Chapter 20 of the same text assigns Gabriel a specific domain of authority, what it calls paradise and the serpents and the cherubim. And chapter 40 describes Gabriel as one of 4 faces surrounding the divine throne itself. Now, I want to be clear that this is extra-canonical material. It tells us what certain Jewish communities believed about Gabriel, not what the Protestant or Catholic Bible states. But it is historically valuable, because fragments of this very text were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirming that these ideas about Gabriel were alive and active in the same world that produced the New Testament. Here is what I find most theologically striking about Gabriel across all of these early sources. Whether you are reading the canonical book of Daniel, or studying the traditions preserved in 1st Enoch, or later reading the Gospel of Luke, Gabriel is consistently positioned as a being who exists in direct proximity to God and then moves outward into the human world, carrying something from that divine presence. Luke chapter 1, verse 19, records Gabriel saying about himself, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God." That is his self-identification. Not a title, not a rank, just a relationship and a location. He stands before God. That is who he is. Many scholars of Second Temple Judaism, including George Nicholsburg in his landmark commentary on 1st Enoch, have noted that this period of Jewish thought, roughly 300 BCE to 70 CE, saw a significant development in how Jewish communities understood angels, moving from relatively simple messenger figures to highly developed celestial beings with defined roles and hierarchies. Gabriel sits at the center of that theological development. As we approach the end of this opening chapter, I want to offer you a thought to carry quietly into the next part of our story. Across the 4 canonical appearances of Gabriel, across the extra-canonical traditions of 1st Enoch, across centuries of Jewish, Christian, Shia and Islamic reflection, one thing remains remarkably constant. Gabriel is always in motion between 2 worlds. He belongs to the divine presence, to whatever that ineffable reality is that the ancient writers called standing before God. And yet he is sent again and again into the very specific, very human, very earthly situations of frightened prophets and confused priests and ordinary young women in small villages. That movement from the eternal to the immediate, from the infinite to the personal, is, I think, the heart of what Gabriel's story is really about. It is a story about communication itself, about the ancient and persistent idea that truth can travel, that what is true in the highest place can somehow reach the lowest and most ordinary moment of a human life. Tonight, as you settle into rest, I invite you to hold that image lightly, a name that means God is my strength. 4 appearances in the canonical text, each one world-changing. A presence so overwhelming that Daniel fell to the ground in terror, and yet so precisely oriented toward human understanding that Gabriel's first recorded act was to help one frightened man comprehend what he had seen. We have only just begun, and already something remarkable is taking shape. In the next chapter, I want to walk with you into the specific historical world that Gabriel first stepped into, the world of Babylon, of exile, of an empire that swallowed nations whole. Because before we can fully understand what Gabriel's messages meant, we need to feel the weight of the world those messages arrived in. So rest now. Let these ancient words settle gently around you. And know that the story we are telling together is one that has been told, in one form or another, for thousands of years. Because something about it, something about this messenger and his mission keeps calling people back. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine a world without maps, without news, without any of the certainties we lean on every day. Imagine instead a world governed entirely by the will of kings, where a single military campaign could erase a nation, where the city you were born in could be taken from you in a single season, and where your gods themselves seem to have lost a war. That is the world Gabriel first stepped into. Not a peaceful world of temples and quiet prayer, but one of the most violent and disorienting periods in all of Israel's long history. I want to walk with you through that world tonight, because without it, Gabriel's messages are just words floating in the air. When we understand the ground those messages landed on, they take on a weight that is almost impossible to describe. So let us go back to the 6th century before the Common Era, back to Babylon, back to the moment when everything Israel knew about itself was stripped away. The story begins with a king whose name most of us recognize, even if we cannot quite place him. Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon. Around the year 605 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar launched a military campaign westward that would change the ancient Near East forever. The book of Daniel opens with this event directly in chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, telling us that Nebuchadnezzar came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and that the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hands. What followed was a systematic dismantling of Israelite society. The temple in Jerusalem, the building that sat at the absolute center of Israelite religious identity, was eventually stripped of its sacred vessels. The nobility, the educated class, the young men of promise and potential were taken away to Babylon. Daniel himself was among them, selected specifically for his intelligence and bearing, brought to the royal court of the greatest empire on earth, and trained in what the text calls Chaldean wisdom and language. What I want you to feel here is not just the political fact of conquest, but the spiritual crisis underneath it. For Israel, this was not simply a military defeat. It raised questions that cut to the very heart of their faith. Here is what makes the historical setting of Daniel so fascinating from a scholarly standpoint, and I think it matters for understanding Gabriel's role in this story. The book of Daniel is written in two languages, Hebrew and Aramaic. The Aramaic sections cover Daniel chapters 2 through 7, and this is not a literary accident or a scribal error. It reflects the real linguistic world of the ancient Near East during the Babylonian and Persian periods. Aramaic was the international language of commerce and administration across the entire region, much the way English functions today. That Daniel moves between Hebrew, the language of Israel's sacred tradition, and Aramaic, the language of empire and diplomacy, tells us something important. It tells us that the people who preserved and shaped these texts were living between two worlds, holding on to their identity as God's people while operating inside the machinery of foreign empires. The Babylonian Chronicle, a remarkable ancient document housed in the British Museum, corroborates Nebuchadnezzar's Western campaigns in exactly this period, giving us independent historical confirmation that the world Daniel describes was real. I find it grounding to know that archaeology and ancient records stand behind these stories, not just faith. Now, the Babylonian Empire that Daniel found himself inside was not some crude or unsophisticated power. Babylon, in the 6th century BCE, was arguably the greatest city in the known world, a place of enormous walls, hanging gardens. See the great Ishtar Gate, with its brilliant blue tiles and golden animals, a ziggurat that may have given rise to the biblical memory of the Tower of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar himself was a builder on a scale almost incomprehensible to the ancient world. Into this place came a young Israelite man named Daniel, stripped of his homeland but not of his faith, trained in the wisdom of the Chaldeans, while quietly maintaining his devotion to the God of his ancestors. The historian Josephus, writing in his monumental work called the Antiquities of the Jews, draws on these same traditions and affirms Daniel's remarkable position within the Babylonian court structure. What I want you to notice is that Gabriel does not appear in a setting of religious comfort and institutional security. He appears to a man who has been displaced, who is living as a captive in a foreign land, who is surrounded by systems of power that have no interest in the God of Israel. There is something deeply human about that setting, something that many people across history have been able to recognize in their own lives. Then the world shifts again, because empires, even the greatest ones, do not last forever. In 539 BCE, the Babylonian Empire fell to Cyrus II of Persia, and the book of Daniel records this moment with remarkable precision. Chapter 5 Verses 30 and 31 tell us that Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed that very night, and that Darius the Mede received the kingdom. This transition matters enormously for our story, because it means that Daniel, the man to whom Gabriel will eventually appear, lived through the collapse of one empire and the rise of another. He was not a young man by this point. He had spent decades navigating the courts of Babylon, maintaining his faith, interpreting dreams, and surviving the kind of political turbulence that would have destroyed most people. The Persian conquest of Babylon was not just a change of government. It brought with it a different religious worldview. Zoroastrianism, with its own developed theology of divine beings, heavenly hierarchies, and cosmic conflict between good and evil. Scholars like John Collins, in his landmark Hermeneia commentary on Daniel, have noted that this period of cultural contact between Jewish and Persian religious ideas was significant for the development of Jewish angelology. Gabriel appears in this meeting point of civilizations and ideas. What did ordinary life look like for the Jewish exiles in Babylon? This is a question the text does not answer directly, but archaeology and history fill in some of the picture. We know from various records of the period that Jewish exiles in Babylon were not generally held as slaves in the brutal sense. They were displaced, yes, forcibly removed from their homeland, but many of them were allowed to settle, to work, to maintain their communities. The prophet Jeremiah, writing to the exiles, famously told them in chapter 29 of his book to build houses, plant gardens, marry and raise families, and seek the welfare of the city where they had been sent. That instruction itself reveals the complex reality of exile. Not the total annihilation of identity that conquest sometimes brought, but a strange, grief-laden existence of living in a foreign place while holding on to a homeland you could not return to. Daniel, chapter 1, tells us that Daniel and his companions were offered the king's own food and wine, a mark of privilege, and that Daniel quietly and persistently found ways to maintain his religious distinctiveness, even within the king's household. This is the man, disciplined, faithful, caught between worlds, to whom Gabriel would eventually speak. I want to pause here and reflect on something that I think the historical context makes clear, something that is easy to miss when we approach Gabriel's story purely as a spiritual or theological matter. Gabriel's first biblical appearance is set deliberately inside a story about empire, about power, about what happens to faith when the world seems to be controlled entirely by forces that have no interest in God. The messages Gabriel carries in the book of Daniel are not gentle reassurances for comfortable, settled people. They are visions of cosmic scope, delivered to a man who has every human reason to wonder whether the God of his ancestors has any power at all in a world where Babylon rules everything. The Babylonian Chronicle, sitting in the British Museum, the Aramaic language woven through the text of Daniel, the archaeological evidence of Nebuchadnezzar's campaigns, all of it places Gabriel's first appearance in the very middle of history, in the most concrete and verifiable kind of human suffering. That is not incidental to the story. I believe that is the point of the story. Now, I also want to share with you something that biblical scholars discuss at length, and that I think is worth knowing as we read Daniel's account of Gabriel. The question of when the book of Daniel was written is genuinely debated among scholars, and I think you deserve an honest account of that debate rather than a simplified version. Conservative scholars, those who read Daniel as a historical document recording actual events from the 6th century BCE, date the book's composition to that same period, seeing it as the direct record of Daniel's own experiences. Critical scholars, however, including many who work in major universities and seminaries around the world, argue that the book was composed much later, perhaps around 165 BCE, during the period of the Maccabean revolt against the Greek ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes. In this reading, the visions Gabriel interprets were written to address the suffering of Jewish people in a different crisis, using the figure of Daniel as a literary frame. Neither position cancels out the spiritual significance of the text, but knowing this debate exists helps us read the story with the intellectual honesty it deserves. Both camps agree on the historical world the text describes. They disagree about when that description was written and for whom. As we begin to move toward the end of this chapter and toward the heart of Gabriel's story, I want to offer you a sense of what all this historical background means for the messenger himself. Gabriel does not arrive in a sterile theological space. He does not appear to people who have everything figured out and simply need a little divine confirmation. Every time Gabriel enters the biblical narrative, he enters into human confusion, human fear, human situations that have become so large and so overwhelming that ordinary understanding simply breaks down. The exile in Babylon was exactly that kind of situation. The world had become too big, too violent, too confusing for any single human perspective to contain. And it is into exactly that kind of world, then and, I think, always, that the figure of Gabriel moves, carrying clarity, carrying understanding, carrying a message from somewhere beyond the empires and the armies and the falling of cities. Let me close this chapter with a thought that I hope you will carry gently into sleep. We have traced the world that Gabriel entered, the Babylonian conquest recorded in Daniel chapter 1, the fall of Jerusalem, the exile of the Israelite people, the eventual rise of Persia, the remarkable linguistic and cultural crossroads where Jewish faith met the great empires of the ancient world. It is a world of enormous scale and human cost. And yet into this world, onto the banks of a real canal, near a real city in what is now the nation of Iran, something arrived that was neither Babylonian nor Persian, that owed nothing to the armies of Nebuchadnezzar or the decree of Cyrus. Something arrived that was oriented entirely toward one frightened human being and the question of understanding. In our next chapter, we will stand on those banks of the Ulai River and watch Gabriel's first recorded biblical appearance unfold. We will hear the voice that commands him. We will see Daniel fall to the ground. And we will listen to what the ancient messenger had to say. For now, rest. The story is just beginning, and there is so much more to come. I want to take you somewhere very specific tonight. Not to a grand temple or a royal palace, though those are part of this story too. I want to take you to the banks of a river, a canal, really, called the Ulai, running near the ancient city of Susa, in what is now the southwestern corner of modern Iran. The year, according to the text, is sometime during the reign of the Babylonian king Belshazzar, perhaps around 550 BCE, though scholars debate the precise dating. A man named Daniel is there, either in person or in the gripping, immersive kind of vision that the ancient writers described as being transported to a place so completely that the body itself responds as though it were real. And in this place, beside this waterway, in a vision of shattering scope and terror, Gabriel makes his first recorded appearance in all of human scripture. I find something quietly extraordinary about the fact that one of the most significant moments in the entire biblical narrative takes place not in Jerusalem, not in the temple, but beside a foreign river in a foreign land. It is as though Gabriel goes to find Daniel exactly where Daniel is, displaced, far from home, trying to make sense of a world that has broken apart. Before Gabriel appears, Daniel sees the vision that Gabriel will later explain. and I want to describe it to you because the vision shapes everything about what follows. Daniel chapter 8 opens with Daniel standing beside the Ulai Canal, and he sees two animals engaged in cosmic scale conflict. The first is a ram with two horns, a powerful, unstoppable creature that charges westward and northward and southward, and nothing can stand against it. Then a goat appears from the west, moving so fast that its feet barely touch the ground, and it has a single large horn between its eyes. This goat attacks the ram with tremendous fury, striking it down and trampling it. Then, at the height of its power, the goat's great horn is broken off, and four smaller horns grow in its place. And from one of those horns, a small horn emerges that grows toward the south, the east, and toward what the text calls the beautiful land, toward Israel. This small horn throws stars down from the heavens, challenges the very host of heaven, and desecrates what the text describes as the regular burnt offering, the daily sacrifice at the temple. It is an overwhelming, frightening, apocalyptic vision. And Daniel, the text tells us, does not understand it at all. Here is the moment I want you to feel carefully, because it is one of the most structurally significant moments in the entire book of Daniel. While Daniel is trying to understand what he has seen, a voice rings out from between the banks of the Ulai. And this is a voice of authority, a voice that issues commands. The text in Daniel chapter 8, verse 16, records the exact words, "Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." That is how Gabriel is introduced to the reader. Not with a grand entrance, not with a description of his appearance, not with a statement of his power. He is introduced by a command given to him, by being sent. What I find striking about this is that Gabriel's identity in the biblical text is established entirely by his function, by what he is told to do, by the direction in which he moves. He is a being who receives a mission and carries it out. And the mission, this first time, is entirely one of understanding, of taking something vast and terrifying and making it comprehensible to a human mind. Now, what actually happens when Gabriel approaches Daniel is something the text describes with remarkable physical specificity, and it is important not to soften it into something prettier than it is. Daniel chapter 8, verse 17 says this: "When Gabriel came near the place where Daniel was standing, Daniel was terrified and fell prostrate, face down on the ground. Then Gabriel says to him, 'Understand, Son of Man, that the vision concerns the time of the end.'" The phrase "Son of Man" here is not the grand messianic title it sometimes carries elsewhere in Scripture. It is a designation of human frailty, of creaturely limitation. Gabriel is essentially saying, you are a finite human being, and this vision concerns things that stretch beyond ordinary human comprehension. Daniel's response, collapsing to the ground in terror, is not weakness. It is, I think, the only honest response available to a human being, confronted with the full weight of what Gabriel carries. The ancient writers did not describe these encounters as peaceful or comfortable, and I think that honesty is one of the things that makes these texts feel real across thousands of years. Gabriel reaches out and raises Daniel to his feet. That gesture, the reaching out, and the lifting up is quiet, and yet it carries everything. Here is a being of such overwhelming presence that a courageous man falls to the ground in terror, and the first thing that being does is lift him back up, because the purpose of this encounter is not to leave Daniel prostrate. The purpose is communication. The purpose is understanding. Gabriel then begins to explain the vision, and what he offers is a remarkably direct interpretive key. The ram with two horns, he tells Daniel in chapter 8, verse 20, represents the kings of Media and Persia. the great empire that was already rising to challenge Babylon's supremacy. The goat that comes from the west, he explains in verse 21, is the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes is the first king. Any reader of ancient history recognizes immediately what Gabriel is describing. The goat moving so fast its feet barely touch the ground, charging from the west and striking down the Median Persian Empire. This matches with extraordinary precision the campaigns of Alexander the Great, who conquered the Persian Empire with a speed that astonished the ancient world. Then Gabriel tells Daniel something about the small horn that emerges from the 4 successor kingdoms, and here the interpretation becomes more contested, because what Gabriel describes next sounds like an escalation of desecration, a figure who will oppose the very Prince of Princes and be broken, though not by human hands. Gabriel says explicitly in Daniel chapter 8 verse 17 and again in verse 19 that this vision concerns the time of the end and the appointed time of the end. Now, what that phrase means has been debated by Jewish and Christian scholars for over 2,000 years. Some understand it as referring to the end of a particular historical period, specifically the crisis under the Greek ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who desecrated the temple in Jerusalem around 167 BCE. Others understand it as pointing toward a much more distant future, a final reckoning at the end of human history. I want to be honest with you that no scholarly consensus exists on this question. What both groups agree on is that Gabriel presents this vision to Daniel as carrying the highest possible significance. These are not minor or local events, but things that shape the entire arc of history. After Gabriel finishes speaking, something happens that I think captures the full human cost of receiving these kinds of visions. Daniel chapter 8, verse 27 says, I, Daniel, was exhausted and lay ill for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. Read those words slowly for a moment, because they carry so much. The vision has made Daniel physically ill. He recovers. He goes back to the mundane work of the king's court, and yet he carries within him something he cannot fully process, something that is, in his own words, beyond understanding, even after Gabriel's explanation. I find this detail remarkably honest and remarkably human. Gabriel has given Daniel the interpretive key. He has explained what the symbols mean, and still the full weight of the vision exceeds what Daniel can hold. This tells us something important about the nature of Gabriel's messages. They are not always tidy conclusions. Sometimes they are openings into a mystery that the human mind can only partially enter. Let me offer a moment of theological reflection here, because I think it matters. Gabriel's explanation in Daniel chapter 8 demonstrates something that has been recognized by scholars across different traditions, a pattern in which divine communication requires both the message and the interpreter. Daniel could not understand the vision alone. He needed Gabriel. The voice from beside the Ulai River needed to send Gabriel to Daniel, because revelation is not always self-explanatory. It arrives in forms that are overwhelming. It is symbolic, larger than ordinary perception, and it requires someone to stand between the source and the receiver, to translate not the words, but the meaning. The theologian Karl Barth, writing in his Church Dogmatics, argued that this is precisely the function of angels. They serve the Word of God, and their entire being is oriented toward that service. Whether or not you share Barth's theological framework, I think his observation captures something true about Gabriel, as the biblical text presents him. Gabriel is not primarily a warrior or a guardian in the book of Daniel. He is an interpreter. He is a being in whom understanding travels from one place to another. As we begin to move toward the close of this chapter, I want to draw your attention to something about this first appearance that sets up everything that follows. Gabriel arrives without warning, without preparation, into a moment of profound human confusion. He does not ask Daniel whether he is ready to receive the vision's meaning. He does not wait for a moment of calm or clarity. He comes when Daniel is already overwhelmed, when the vision has already knocked him to the ground, and he does his work in that messy and frightened human moment. That pattern, Gabriel arriving into the middle of human crisis rather than at a comfortable remove from it, is something we will see repeated across every appearance he makes in the biblical record. There is something deeply moving to me about a messenger of such power who consistently chooses the messy, frightened, confused human moment as the place to deliver understanding. Tonight, let this first encounter between Gabriel and Daniel rest gently in your mind as you drift towards sleep. We stood beside the Ulai Canal, a real place near the real ancient city of Susa, and we watched a man of faith collapse to the ground in the presence of something far beyond ordinary human experience. We heard Gabriel speak the first words he ever speaks in the Bible. Not a battle cry, not a curse, not a proclamation of power, but an explanation offered to a frightened human being who needed to understand. And we sat with Daniel afterward, in his exhaustion and his confusion, in his honest admission that even with Gabriel's help, the vision remained partly beyond him. In our next chapter, we will meet Gabriel again in the same book of Daniel, but in a different and even more famous encounter, one that has generated more theological debate than almost any other single passage in the entire Bible. Daniel will be praying, and Gabriel will arrive in swift flight, and the message he brings will set scholars and believers arguing across 25 centuries. Rest now. The story continues, and it only grows deeper. There are moments in the ancient texts that seem simple on the surface. A prayer, a response, a series of numbers. And yet beneath that surface lies a depth that has occupied the greatest theological minds in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic history for over 2,000 years. Tonight, I want to take you into one of those moments. We return to the book of Daniel, but to a different chapter, a different year, and a different kind of encounter with Gabriel. This time, Daniel is not seized by an overwhelming vision that throws him to the ground. This time, Daniel is praying, earnestly, urgently, with fasting and sackcloth and ashes, pouring out his heart before God on behalf of his people. And into that prayer, without warning, Gabriel arrives. What Gabriel says in the next few verses of Daniel chapter 9 has been called one of the most debated prophecies in all of Scripture. I want to walk through it with you carefully and honestly, not pretending that there are easy answers, but letting you feel the weight and the beauty of the text itself. First, let me give you the context for Daniel's prayer, because it matters deeply. The opening verse of Daniel chapter 9 tells us that Daniel was reading the scrolls, specifically the writings of the prophet Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah, in chapter 25, verses 11 and 12, he found a specific prophecy that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years, and then God would restore his people. Daniel does the arithmetic. He realizes the 70 years are drawing to a close. And instead of simply waiting for the prophecy to fulfill itself, he does something that I find profoundly moving. He prays. He prays with his whole self in fasting and grief and ash and sackcloth, confessing on behalf of his people, on behalf of all the ways Israel had turned away from the covenant, on behalf of everything that had brought them to exile in the first place. His prayer runs from verse 4 to verse 19 of Daniel chapter 9, and it is one of the most beautiful and honest prayers in the entire Old Testament. He does not bargain. He does not demand. He simply places himself and his people before God with full acknowledgement of their failures and full confidence in God's mercy. Now watch what happens next, because the timing here is startling. Daniel chapter 9 verse 20 tells us that while Daniel was still speaking, while the prayer was still forming in his mouth, while the words were still moving from his heart outward, Gabriel arrived. The text says, Gabriel came to me in swift flight. There is a translation difficulty in that phrase that I want to be honest about, because scholars note that the Hebrew is somewhat ambiguous. It could suggest swift motion, or it could relate to a state of weariness, and different translations handle it differently. But what is unmistakable is the immediacy. There is no gap between the prayer and the response. Gabriel arrives before Daniel has finished speaking, and then Gabriel says words that are among the most tender in all of his recorded speech. Daniel, I have now come to give you insight and understanding. As soon as you began to pray, a command was given. Let me sit with that for a moment. As soon as Daniel began to pray, before the prayer was finished, the response was already in motion. Gabriel then delivers what is known as the prophecy of the 70 weeks. And I want to walk through it with you carefully, because these words in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 through 27, are among the most analyzed in all of religious history. Gabriel says that 70 weeks, in Hebrew, Shavuim Shivim, literally 70 sevens, are decreed upon Daniel's people and his holy city. What follows is a list of what these 70 weeks are meant to accomplish: to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Then Gabriel gives a more detailed breakdown: 7 weeks, then 62 weeks, then a final week, within which an anointed one, the Hebrew word Mashiach, will appear and eventually be cut off. The city and the sanctuary will be destroyed by a coming prince. And in that final week, a covenant will be established and then broken, and something described as an abomination that causes desolation will be set up. Here is where I must be completely honest with you, because the history of interpretation around these verses is genuinely complex and genuinely contested, and you deserve to know that. Different traditions and different scholars read this passage in radically different ways, and none of the interpretations can be dismissed as simply careless or uninformed. Each one draws on real textual analysis and real historical evidence. The first major interpretation, dominant in Christian evangelical and dispensationalist traditions, associated with scholars like John Walvoord, reads the 69 weeks as pointing precisely to the coming of Jesus of Nazareth, and sees a gap between the 69th and 70th week, with the final week still in the future. The second major interpretation, dominant in historical critical scholarship, reads the entire prophecy as referring to events in the Maccabean period. The crisis under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, around 167 BCE, who did indeed desecrate the Jerusalem temple by setting up a pagan altar within it. Jewish scholars generally favor this reading. Both are real, serious positions. What I find fascinating, and what gets lost sometimes in the heat of interpretive debate, is the fact that Gabriel is presented in this passage as a being of extraordinary care for Daniel personally. Look at Daniel chapter 9, verse 23. Gabriel says to Daniel, "You are highly esteemed." The Hebrew word used there, shamudot, means something like precious one or greatly beloved. It is a word of deep affection, of personal regard. Daniel is one of only two figures in the book of Daniel who receive this designation. The same phrase appears again in chapter 10. Gabriel is not arriving with a cold or distant theological briefing. He is coming to a person he identifies as precious, a person whose prayer has already been heard and responded to before the prayer was even finished. Whatever the 70 weeks mean, historically or eschatologically, they are delivered within a framework of personal regard, of one being deeply aware of another. That relational dimension of Gabriel's visit to Daniel seems to me worth far more attention than it usually receives. Now, there is one more dimension of this passage that I want to share, because it appears in Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, and it has shaped enormous amounts of theological reflection across centuries. Gabriel speaks of an anointed one, the Hebrew Mashiach, who will be cut off and will have nothing. The word Mashiach is the same root from which the English word Messiah derives, and the Greek word Christos, Christ. For Christian readers across 20 centuries, this verse has been understood as a direct prediction of the death of Jesus, the cutting off of the Anointed One. For Jewish readers, the Anointed One of this passage is typically identified as a historical figure within the late Second Temple period. For critical scholars, the passage reflects the experience of the Maccabean crisis. I am not here to tell you which reading is correct. That is a matter for your own study and discernment. And there are brilliant, faithful people in each tradition. What I can tell you is that Gabriel's speech in Daniel chapter 9 is one of the most generative texts in religious history, one that has shaped Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theological reflection for over 2 millennia, precisely because it uses compressed, symbolic language to gesture towards something whose full meaning human beings are still debating. Let me offer a moment of theological reflection that I think honors the full weight of this text. Gabriel arrives while Daniel is praying. He says the command was issued as soon as Daniel began to pray. Then he delivers a message of extraordinary complexity and scope. 70 weeks of decreed history, an anointed one who will be cut off, desolation, covenant, and renewal. And Daniel himself, even receiving this from Gabriel, is left grappling with its meaning. The scholar John Collins, in his Hermeneia commentary on Daniel, notes that the symbolic language of Daniel's prophecies was designed to carry meaning across different historical moments, to be read and reread by communities facing different crises, finding in the same words the God who speaks to their specific situation. If that is true, then Gabriel's message in Daniel chapter 9 is not a locked puzzle with a single correct solution. It is a living text that has accompanied God's people through exile, persecution, theological uncertainty, and historical upheaval, always carrying the same fundamental assurance that history has a shape, that the Anointed One matters, and that the one who sends Gabriel has not forgotten the people who pray. As we begin to move toward the close of this chapter, I want to sit for a moment in the experience of Daniel himself after this encounter. There is no record in chapter 9 of Daniel falling prostrate as he did in chapter 8. Perhaps the tenderness of Gabriel's opening words, "You are highly esteemed, Daniel, and consider carefully the word I am about to speak to you," created a different atmosphere in this encounter. Perhaps Daniel had grown, through experience, into a greater capacity to receive what Gabriel carried. What we do know is that the message Gabriel delivers in chapter 9 is the last canonical record of Gabriel's activity in the Old Testament. He came twice to Daniel in 2 different years, under 2 different kings, carrying 2 different messages, both of them concerned with understanding, with the meaning of history, with the question of how God's purposes move through the wreckage of empires. And then Gabriel disappears from the Old Testament record, leaving Daniel with words that would be read and debated and prayed over by communities facing crises he could not have imagined. Tonight, let the tenderness inside this difficult text be the thing that stays with you as you rest. Gabriel arrives before Daniel's prayer is finished. He calls Daniel precious. He comes not to overwhelm, but to illuminate, not to terrify, but to grant insight. The 70 weeks may remain partially mysterious. Scholars across centuries have wrestled with their meaning and will continue to do so. But the relational heart of this encounter is clear and simple. A man prays with his whole heart, and before he finishes, something moves toward him, carrying a message of care. In our next chapter, we will step outside the canonical Bible entirely for a moment and look at what ancient Jewish communities in the centuries around the time of Jesus were saying about Gabriel in a remarkable and ancient text called First Enoch, whose influence on early Christian thought is greater than most people realize. Rest now and let the ancient words settle quietly around you. There is a category of ancient religious writing that most people have never encountered, and yet it shaped the world into which both Jesus and the earliest Christians were born more deeply than almost any other body of literature. Tonight, I want to open a door into that world for you, not to replace or compete with the biblical texts we have been exploring together, but to show you a richer, more layered picture of what people in the ancient Jewish world believed about Gabriel and the angels around the time of the New Testament. The collection of writings we call Second Temple literature, texts produced between roughly 300 BCE and 70 CE, during the period when the Second Temple stood in Jerusalem, is a vast treasury of religious imagination, historical memory, and spiritual longing. And somewhere near the center of that treasury sits a text called First Enoch. I want to sit with you beside this ancient writing tonight and listen to what it says about the angel we have been following, because what it says is remarkable, and it helps explain why Gabriel became who he became in Christian, Jewish, and eventually Islamic tradition. Let me first tell you what First Enoch is and where it stands in the landscape of religious texts, because I want to be clear and honest with you from the start. First Enoch is not part of the Protestant biblical canon. It is not in the Catholic Bible either, though the Catholic Church recognizes its historical importance. It is, however, considered canonical scripture, fully inspired, fully authoritative, by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which is one of the oldest continuous Christian communities in the world. Beyond that, the Book of Jude in the New Testament, which is canonical for all Christians, directly quotes from First Enoch in chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, attributing the quote to Enoch, the seventh from Adam. That single fact tells us something important. The early Christian writers were not unaware of this text. At least one New Testament author knew it well enough to quote it as authoritative. Whether First Enoch is scripture or not depends on your tradition, but what it cannot be dismissed as is irrelevant. It was deeply alive in the world that produced the New Testament. Now here is what makes First Enoch especially significant for our story tonight. The biblical book of Daniel, as we explored in our previous chapters, gives us Gabriel's name and Gabriel's function. He is the interpreter, the one sent to make understanding possible. But it gives us almost nothing about Gabriel's nature, his standing, his relationship to other angelic beings, or his broader role in the cosmic order. First, Enoch fills in a picture that the biblical text leaves largely blank, and it does so with extraordinary specificity and vividness. Chapter 9 of First Enoch opens with an image that I want you to hold in your mind for a moment. 4 great angels, Michael, Zechariah, Gabriel, and Uriel, look down from heaven and see the earth filling with blood and lawlessness, the consequence of the watchers, the heavenly beings who have left their proper place and corrupted the earth. These four angels hear the cries of humanity rising up to heaven, and together they bring what they have seen before God. They are, in this image, not just messengers. They are the beings who stand close enough to God to bring human suffering directly to divine attention. The story behind this scene in 1 Enoch chapter 9 involves what the text calls the Watchers, angelic beings who, according to this tradition, looked upon human women and desired them, came down from heaven and produced offspring of enormous size and destructive power called the Nephilim. The Watchers also taught humanity things it was not ready to know: the making of weapons, the arts of seduction, the reading of heavenly signs for corrupt purposes. The result was a world of violence and chaos, and the cries of the victims of that violence rise up until Gabriel and his companions hear them and bring them before God. In 1 Enoch chapter 10, verse 9, God gives Gabriel a specific and dramatic assignment. He is to go to the offspring of the Watchers, the so-called bastards, and destroy them. He is sent not as a messenger of words this time, but as an agent of divine judgment against the corruption that has overtaken the earth. This is a very different picture of Gabriel than the one we find in Daniel. More active, more militarily engaged, more directly involved in the physical consequences of cosmic events. First, Enoch chapter 20 gives us yet another dimension of Gabriel's identity. In a list of the archangels and their specific areas of responsibility, verse 7 assigns Gabriel authority over what the text calls paradise and the serpents and the cherubim. What I find interesting about this is the combination of domains. Paradise, the serpents, and the cherubim are all associated in the Hebrew tradition with the Genesis narrative, with the garden and what happened there. Gabriel's authority in this reckoning touches the most primal layer of the biblical story, the very beginning, the very first crisis in the relationship between God and humanity. Then, in chapter 40 of 1 Enoch, verses 6 through 9, we encounter the image that may be the most theologically significant of all. Gabriel is described as one of four presences, four faces, that surround God's throne itself. He is not at the periphery of heaven, he is at the center. He is among the beings closest to the one who sends him. When Luke records Gabriel saying, "I stand in the presence of God," he is using language that 1 Enoch had already been using for centuries about this same figure. Now, I want to be careful here and transparent with you, as I always want to be in these chapters. The traditions in 1 Enoch are not historical records. They are religious and theological reflections, imaginative, visionary, deeply Jewish explorations of questions the biblical text leaves open. The ancient writers of 1 Enoch were not journalists or historians in any modern sense. They were people of faith trying to understand the nature of heaven, the reality of evil, the question of why suffering exists in a world that is supposed to belong to God. And they used the figure of Gabriel alongside Michael and Uriel and the other great angels as a way of thinking through those questions. When 1 Enoch says Gabriel destroyed the Nephilim or governs paradise, it is not making claims we can verify archaeologically or historically. It is making theological claims about the kind of being Gabriel is and the kind of God who sends him. The Dead Sea Scrolls, however, which are genuinely ancient physical documents found in caves near the Dead Sea, beginning in 1947, do contain fragments that scholars identify as 4Q227, referencing Enochic angelic traditions, confirming that these ideas were circulating in the same Jewish communities and the same time period that produced the canonical texts. There is one more piece of the 1 Enoch tradition I want to share with you. because it has had an enormous influence on how Gabriel was understood in later Christian and Jewish tradition. The songs of the Sabbath, sacrifice, found among the Dead Sea Scrolls as texts 4, Q 400 through 4, Q 407, describe angelic liturgy in heaven, the worship that goes on constantly before the divine throne, the prayers and songs of the heavenly beings who never cease to stand in God's presence. Gabriel is not named explicitly in these texts, but the vision of heaven they describe, layered, hierarchical, filled with beings of different orders, all engaged in ceaseless worship and service, is precisely the kind of heaven in which Gabriel's self-description in Luke chapter 1, verse 19 makes perfect sense. I stand in the presence of God, Gabriel says. The songs of the Sabbath, sacrifice, help us understand what that standing looks like, what kind of place and what kind of activity that presence involves. Here is something I find genuinely moving when I look at First Enoch and the surrounding literature as a whole. The ancient Jewish communities who produced and treasured these texts were, in many cases, communities under enormous pressure, displaced, persecuted, living under foreign rulers, watching their traditions threatened and their peoples suffer. And into that experience of threat and suffering, they imagined a heaven full of beings who see, who hear, who bring human pain before God. Gabriel, in First Enoch, does not live in a heaven of cold divine distance. He lives in a heaven that is actively aware of what is happening on earth, actively distressed by it, and actively engaged in bringing it before the one who can respond. That image of heaven, responsive, relational, close, is, I think, one of the most beautiful things First Enoch gives us. And it is entirely consistent with the Gabriel we meet in Daniel, who arrives before Daniel's prayer is finished, because the command was given as soon as you began to pray. As we approach the end of this chapter, I want to draw a thread that connects everything we have explored tonight to where our story goes next. First Enoch and the broader Second Temple literature expanded the portrait of Gabriel beyond what the canonical texts alone provide, giving him a place in the heavenly hierarchy, a role in cosmic conflict, a domain of authority, and a position close to the throne of God. That expanded portrait was alive in the Jewish world of the 1st century CE. The people who heard the Gospel of Luke's account of Gabriel's appearance to Zechariah and to Mary were not encountering an unknown figure. They were encountering an angel whose name and whose reputation they already knew from texts like First Enoch, an angel associated with divine strength, with the destruction of evil, with paradise, with the very throne of God. When Gabriel says, I stand in the presence of God, those listeners knew in their bones what that meant. Tonight, let the richness of this ancient tradition rest gently with you as you move towards sleep. We have walked together through texts that most people never encounter, texts from outside the biblical canon, but deeply woven into the world the biblical canon was born from. We heard First Enoch describe Gabriel as one of 4 great angels before the throne, as an agent of judgment against corruption, as a guardian of paradise and its serpents and its cherubim. We acknowledged honestly that these are theological reflections, not historical records, but we also saw that they were real, read, copied, treasured, buried in clay jars in the caves above the Dead Sea by people who loved them. In our next chapter, we leave these ancient apocalyptic visions and step into a very different scene. A temple in Jerusalem, a burning altar of incense, an old priest performing his once-in-a-lifetime duty, and a silence of 400 years about to be broken. Gabriel is coming back into the canonical record, and the world will never be the same. Rest now. We will meet him there together. And tonight, I want to begin with a kind of silence. Not the comfortable silence of a peaceful evening, but the particular silence that settles over a people who have been waiting for a very long time and have begun to wonder quietly and with some grief whether anyone is still listening. By the time our story moves from the book of Daniel into the Gospel of Luke, something like 4 centuries have passed since Gabriel last appeared in the canonical biblical record. 400 years of history, of foreign rulers, of religious upheaval, of empires rising and falling over the land of Israel. And through all of it, the prophetic voice that Israel had come to rely on had, by most accounts within the Jewish tradition, gone quiet. The rabbis would later describe this period as one in which the Holy Spirit had departed from Israel, in which direct divine communication through the prophets had ceased. I want you to feel the weight of that silence as we walk together into the opening chapter of the Gospel of Luke, because what happens there is not just a story about an old priest and an angel. It is a story about a silence finally, gently, and with extraordinary tenderness, being broken. The man at the center of this story is named Zechariah, and the Gospel of Luke introduces him with a level of biographical detail that the Gospel writer clearly wants us to notice. Luke chapter 1, verse 5, tells us that Zechariah was a priest belonging to the priestly division of Abijah. Now, that single detail carries more historical weight than it might first appear. All the way back in the book of 1 Chronicles, chapter 24, verse 10, we find the record of King David organizing the priests of Israel into 24 rotating divisions for temple service. And Abijah is the 8th of those 24 divisions. This organizational system, established centuries before Zechariah was born, meant that each priestly division would serve in the temple approximately twice a year, for 1 week at a time. The historian Josephus, writing in his Antiquities of the Jews in Book 7, chapter 14, confirms and describes this same system of priestly rotation. What this means for Zechariah is that his moment of temple service, the moment when Gabriel will find him, is not a daily routine. It is a rare and precious appointment, something he has perhaps waited his entire adult life for in its fullest expression. Within that appointed week of service, something even more specific happens to Zechariah. By the custom of the priestly divisions, the specific duties within the temple were assigned by lot, by a kind of sacred chance, a casting of lots that the community understood as God's own selection. And the lot falls to Zechariah to enter the sanctuary of the Lord and burn incense. Luke chapter 1, verse 9, records this moment with quiet simplicity. The altar of incense stood inside what was called the holy place, the inner chamber of the temple, the space directly in front of the veil that separated ordinary access from the most holy place where God's presence was said to dwell most intensely. Only priests could enter this space, and even for priests, burning incense at this altar was considered the highest privilege of priestly service, something a priest might do only once in his entire lifetime, if the lot ever fell to him at all. So when Zechariah crosses the threshold of the holy place to burn incense, he is standing in the holiest accessible space on earth, performing the holiest act of his priestly vocation, while the people of Israel gathered outside to pray during the time of incense. There is a hush over the entire scene, and then Gabriel appears. Luke chapter 1, verse 11, describes Gabriel's position with a specificity that I find striking. He was standing at the right side of the altar of incense, not hovering, not blazing with light. Standing, present, specific, located. The right side of the altar is the south side in the temple's orientation, and there are traditions in Jewish interpretation that associate the right side with blessing and favor. though the text itself does not make that connection explicit. What the text does make explicit is Zechariah's response. And it is the same response we saw in Daniel, the same response that seems to be the only honest human reaction to Gabriel's presence. Luke chapter 1, verse 12, says that when Zechariah saw him, he was startled and gripped with fear. The Greek word used there, eterashtha, suggests a deep internal disturbance, not just a fright, but a shaking of the entire inner world. And Gabriel's very first words, just as they will be when he appears to Mary just months later, are words that acknowledge and address that fear directly. He says in Luke chapter 1, verse 13, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard." Now, I want to pause on those words for a moment, because I think they are more layered than they first appear. Your prayer has been heard. Which prayer? Zechariah is, at this moment, performing his priestly duty of burning incense, and the burning of incense in the temple was itself a liturgical act of intercession, representing the prayers of all Israel rising before God. But there is also, almost certainly, a more personal prayer buried beneath the official priestly function. Luke chapter 1, verse 7 tells us something quietly heartbreaking about Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth. They were both very old, and Elizabeth was barren, unable to have children. In the ancient world, in the Jewish tradition, the longing for a child was among the most profound and personal of all prayers. It was the prayer of Sarah and Abraham, of Hannah before the birth of Samuel, of Rachel weeping and refusing to be comforted. Zechariah and Elizabeth had carried this longing, we can assume, for decades, had prayed it, had perhaps long since stopped expecting an answer, had made their peace, however painful, with what seemed to be God's silence on this most personal of requests. And Gabriel arrives and says, "Your prayer has been heard." I find that moment almost unbearably tender. Gabriel then delivers his message in a sequence of specifics that moves from the personal to the cosmic in just a handful of sentences. Luke chapter 1, verses 13 through 15 tell us that Zechariah's wife Elizabeth will bear him a son, that this son is to be named John, that he will be a joy and delight not just to his parents, but to many people, and that he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He will never drink wine or fermented drink. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from birth. A remarkable statement, suggesting a sanctification that begins before the child draws his first breath outside the womb. Then Gabriel expands the announcement outward from the personal miracle to the prophetic mission, saying in verse 16 that John will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God, and in verse 17 that he will go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. That reference to Elijah is a direct connection to the prophecy in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, the very last prophetic words in the Old Testament, which speak of God sending Elijah before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Gabriel is not just announcing a birth. He is announcing that the long prophetic silence is over and that something entirely new is beginning. Zechariah's response to all of this is deeply human, and I say that without any intention of criticism. He asks Gabriel in Luke chapter 1, verse 18, "How can I be sure of this? I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years." It is the question of a man whose hope has been worn down by decades of waiting, a man who has perhaps learned to protect himself from disappointment by requiring evidence before he allows himself to believe. It is, honestly, not so different from the questions many of us carry. The quiet, guarded part of us that has been disappointed before and does not rush to trust again. But Gabriel's response to this very human question is unexpectedly sharp. He identifies himself, and this is the first time in the Gospel of Luke that Gabriel gives his name in verse 19. I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And then, because Zechariah has not believed the words that will come true at their appointed time, Gabriel tells him that he will be silent, unable to speak, until the day that these things come to pass. Zechariah leaves the holy place, unable to speak, and the people waiting outside realize something extraordinary has happened in the sanctuary. Here is a thought that I keep returning to when I read this account. Gabriel identifies himself with two things: his name and his location. I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God. He does not say, I am the angel of great power, or I am the destroyer of nations, or any of the more martial descriptions we find in the extra-canonical literature. He grounds his identity in relationship and in proximity, in who he is and where he stands. And the authority of his message, the reason Zechariah should believe it, rests entirely on those two things. The name Gabriel, God is my strength. The position, in the presence of God. Everything that follows flows from those two foundations. I think there is something quietly profound in that self-introduction that gets missed when we focus only on the miracle of the announcement. Gabriel is not asking Zechariah to trust a powerful being or an overwhelming force. He is asking him to trust a messenger whose entire identity is defined by his closeness to the one who sent him. As we approach the close of this chapter, I want to draw your attention to the note that Luke chapter 1 ends Zechariah's story on, because it matters for everything that follows. Luke records in verse 23 that when Zechariah's time of service was completed, he returned home. His wife Elizabeth became pregnant. And in verse 24, Elizabeth says, "The Lord has done this for me. In these days he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people." The long silence, the personal silence of barrenness, the communal silence of prophetic absence, has begun to break open. A child is growing in Elizabeth's womb who will prepare the way for something even greater. And Gabriel is not finished. His most famous and most world-altering mission is still ahead, and it will happen just a few months later, not in the grandeur of the temple in Jerusalem, but in a small village in Galilee, to a young woman whose name is Mary. The scale of what is coming makes Zechariah's story feel like the first note of a symphony whose full sound we are just beginning to hear. Tonight, let the tenderness of this encounter settle gently into you as you rest. An old priest in the holiest room on earth, shaking with fear at the sight of a presence he did not expect. A prayer spoken over a lifetime finally reaching its answer. A name given, Gabriel, carrying with it the weight of divine strength and the intimacy of divine presence. And a sign, Zechariah walking out of the temple, unable to speak, while the people waited outside and understood, in the particular way that communities of faith understand things, that something sacred had just passed through. The silence of 400 years is ending. The messenger has returned. And in our next chapter, we will follow Gabriel to the most celebrated moment in his entire story. A door, a greeting, a young woman's startled face, and words that changed the world forever. Rest now. Let the quiet hold you. We will meet Mary in the morning. Of all the chapters in Gabriel's story, this is the one that has most deeply shaped the imagination of the Western world. It has been painted by more artists than almost any other scene in human history. Fra Angelico and Leonardo da Vinci and Botticelli and countless others returning again and again to the same moment, trying to capture something in oil and gold leaf and pigment that resists full capture. It has been set to music, written into poetry, carved into stone above cathedral doors across Europe. Tonight, I want to take you back past all of that accumulated beauty, past all the art and tradition and theological commentary, and sit with you in the simplest possible version of this story, the one Luke actually tells. Because what the Gospel of Luke records in chapter 1, verses 26 through 38, is both more intimate and more startling than the grand artistic tradition sometimes suggests. I want to walk with you through it slowly, the way you might walk through a place you have visited many times and suddenly see clearly as if for the first time. The setting that Luke gives us is almost aggressively ordinary. Gabriel is sent. Once again, the text uses that word, sent, emphasizing the directionality, the purposeful dispatch from one place to another, to a town called Nazareth in Galilee. Luke chapter 1, verse 26. Now, Nazareth in the first century was not a place of significance. It does not appear in the Old Testament. It is not mentioned by Josephus among the major towns of Galilee. Archaeological excavations of the site, and there have been significant ones confirming first-century habitation of the area, suggest it was a small, rural village, perhaps home to a few hundred people, dependent on agriculture and the modest commerce of the Galilean hillside. This was not Jerusalem, not Capernaum, not Caesarea. It was a place that, in the famous words attributed to Nathanael in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 46, prompted the question, can anything good come from Nazareth? Gabriel does not go to a palace or a temple or a seat of learning. He goes to a small house in a small village to find a young woman that the world has not noticed and has no particular reason to notice. Her name is Mary. Luke chapter 1, verse 27 tells us three things about her. She is a virgin. She is pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, and Joseph is of the house of David. That third detail, the Davidic lineage, is quietly essential because it connects everything that is about to be announced to the great promises made to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the promises of a throne that would be established forever. Mary herself is not described in terms of lineage or social standing. She is simply a young woman, pledged and waiting, living in an ordinary village, going about whatever an ordinary day in Nazareth looked like in the first century. And then Gabriel arrives. Luke does not tell us how. There is no description of light or sound or any of the atmospheric drama that popular imagination tends to supply. He simply comes to her and says, in the words of verse 28, the greeting that has echoed through 2,000 years of Christian devotion. Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you. I want to spend a moment with the Greek word at the heart of that greeting, because it matters more than most translations fully convey, and it has been at the center of significant theological discussion for centuries. The word Luke uses is charitomene. It is a perfect passive participle of the verb charitou, which relates to charis, the Greek word for grace or favor. When Gabriel addresses Mary with this word, he is using a form that suggests a completed action with ongoing effect. She has been graced, she is in a state of grace, the favor rests upon her. The Catholic tradition, particularly in light of the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, has historically translated this as full of grace, a translation preserved in the traditional Hail Mary prayer, and reads in it a theological statement about Mary's unique status from the moment of her own conception. Protestant scholars generally translate it as highly favored, and understand it as describing God's choice of Mary for this specific mission rather than a permanent ontological state. The biblical scholar Joseph Fitzmyer, in his Anchor Bible commentary on the Gospel of Luke, gives an extensive analysis of this single word and acknowledges the genuine complexity of what it carries. Both traditions are reading real Greek carefully. They are simply weighted toward different conclusions. Mary's response to Gabriel's greeting is one of the most honestly rendered reactions in the entire New Testament. Luke chapter 1, verse 29 says she was greatly troubled by his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. The Greek word for troubled there, diataraktha, is even stronger than the word used to describe Zechariah's fear. Mary does not simply flinch. She is deeply, internally disturbed, and she does something remarkable in that disturbance, she thinks. She wonders. She tries to reason through what is happening to her. There is no description of her falling to the ground. She no collapse into unconsciousness. She stands or sits or remains wherever she is, and she engages her mind with what Gabriel has said. I find this detail about Mary quietly extraordinary. In the middle of an encounter that would have shattered most people entirely, she thinks. Gabriel then moves quickly to address her fear. "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God," and immediately proceeds to the announcement that I believe is the most significant communication in the entire biblical record. What Gabriel tells Mary in Luke chapter 1, verses 31 through 33, is delivered in a carefully structured sequence, and I want to walk through each element because each one carries enormous weight. First, Gabriel says she will conceive and give birth to a son, and she is to call him Jesus, the Greek form of the Hebrew name Yeshua, meaning "the Lord saves." Then Gabriel describes this child in terms that are, by any measure, extraordinary. "He will be great," Gabriel says. "He will be called the Son of the Most High. The Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over Jacob's descendants forever, and his kingdom will never end." Listen to the architecture of that announcement. It moves from the intimate and personal, a son, a name, to the political and dynastic, the throne of David, to the cosmic and eternal, a kingdom with no end. Gabriel is not merely announcing a birth. He is announcing the fulfillment of promises that stretch back through Nathan's prophecy to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, through the messianic hope of Isaiah and the Psalms, through the entire arc of Israel's covenantal history. The announcement lands in a small room in Nazareth, but its reach is without boundary. Mary asks a question, and here is where her question differs profoundly from Zechariah's, in a way that the text itself seems to mark carefully. Zechariah asked, "How can I be sure of this?" A question oriented toward evidence and certainty, toward proof of the thing before he would believe it. Mary asks in Luke chapter 1, verse 34, "How will this be since I am a virgin?" Her question is not about whether this will happen. It is about the mechanism by which it will happen. She is not asking Gabriel to prove himself. She is asking, with genuine and open curiosity, how something she cannot currently understand will come to pass. Gabriel's answer moves into territory that is deeply mysterious and has been the subject of profound theological reflection across 2 millennia. "The Holy Spirit will come upon you," he says. "The power of the Most High will overshadow you, and therefore the one to be born will be called the Son of God." The word overshadow there, episkiasi in the Greek, echoes the language used in Exodus when the glory of God filled the tabernacle, and in other places where the divine presence descends upon something or someone in the Hebrew tradition. Gabriel then offers Mary a sign that she did not ask for. news that her relative Elizabeth, who was said to be unable to conceive, is already 6 months pregnant. He closes with what I consider the most theologically essential sentence of his entire speech: "For no word from God will ever fail." Mary's response, what the Catholic tradition calls the fiat, from the Latin translation of her words, is brief and complete. Luke chapter 1, verse 38. "I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled." And then Luke records, with the same quiet simplicity that characterizes this entire encounter: "Gabriel left her. He came, he spoke, she answered. He left." There is no lingering, no grand departure, no description of how Gabriel returned to wherever he had come from. The encounter is complete. What I find remarkable in Mary's response is the combination of two things that are not always easy to hold together: absolute surrender and genuine agency. She does not simply collapse into compliance. She identifies herself: "I am the Lord's servant." She makes an active choice, using her own voice, in her own words, to say yes to something whose full implications she cannot possibly yet understand. The biblical scholar Raymond Brown, in his landmark work, The Birth of the Messiah, calls this moment the hinge point of the entire Lucan infancy narrative. And I think that is exactly right. As I reflect on the full weight of this encounter, something strikes me that I want to share with you. Gabriel has now appeared twice in the Gospel of Luke, and the contrast between the two appearances reveals something important about how the text portrays the relationship between divine invitation and human response. Zechariah, in the temple, in the holiest room available to a human being, surrounded by the full apparatus of priestly religion, responds with doubt and receives silence as a sign. Mary, in a small house in an unremarkable village, with none of the institutional religious context that surrounded Zechariah, responds with trust and receives the most world-altering responsibility ever placed on a human being. I am not suggesting the text is being harsh to Zechariah. His doubt is deeply understandable, and he too becomes part of the great unfolding story. But the contrast does seem deliberate, and it seems to be saying something about where God's most significant work tends to happen, and about the kind of response that makes space for the impossible. Tonight, as you settle into rest, let the image of this encounter hold you gently. A small room in Nazareth, a young woman troubled and thinking, an angel who begins, as he always does, by addressing fear, and a conversation that moved, in the space of a few sentences, from an ordinary greeting to the announcement of an eternal kingdom. Mary said yes to something she could not fully understand, in a moment she could not have prepared for, with a faith that the text presents as simple and complete and world-changing. In our next chapter, we will step back from the biblical text and look at something different, at how this moment, this encounter between Gabriel and Mary, was reimagined over the centuries by artists and theologians and the great tradition of Christian iconography. We will discover that the Gabriel most people picture, winged, robed, holding a lily, is largely a creation of that tradition rather than a description found in Scripture. It is a fascinating story, and it tells us as much about the people who imagined Gabriel as it does about Gabriel himself. Rest now. Let Mary's yes be the last thought you carry into sleep. There is a version of Gabriel that almost everyone carries in their mind, even people who have never read a word of the Bible. He is tall and luminous. He has great white wings arching behind him. He is draped in flowing robes, often white or gold or blue. In some images, he holds a white lily. In others, he carries a staff or a scroll. His face is serene and otherworldly, and his entire bearing communicates something between grandeur and gentleness. This is the Gabriel of the Western imagination, shaped by 2,000 years of Christian art, refined through Byzantine icon painters and Florentine masters and medieval illuminators and cathedral sculptors, until he became one of the most recognizable figures in all of human visual culture. Tonight, I want to sit with you in front of this long gallery of images and ask a question that I think is worth asking honestly. How much of what we picture when we think of Gabriel actually comes from the biblical text? And how much comes from the imagination of artists and theologians working centuries after that text was written? The answer, as we will discover together, is surprising, and it reveals something beautiful about the way human beings have always tried to picture what they cannot fully see. Let me begin with what the canonical text does not say, because I think it matters to establish this clearly and without apology. The 4 passages in which Gabriel is named in the Protestant biblical canon, Daniel chapter 8 and 9, Luke chapter 1, verses 19 and 26, contain no physical description of Gabriel whatsoever. None. Daniel describes his terror at Gabriel's approach, but he does not describe what Gabriel looks like. Luke tells us Gabriel came to Zechariah and then to Mary, but offers no details of his appearance. There are no wings mentioned, no robes described, no radiance recorded for Gabriel specifically in any of these texts. The winged beings of the Hebrew Bible, the seraphim of Isaiah chapter 6 with their 6 wings, and the 4-winged living creatures of Ezekiel chapter 1 are distinct figures, not identified as Gabriel. The assumption that all angels have wings, and therefore that Gabriel must have wings, is an inference drawn from other scriptural passages and then projected onto Gabriel, who is never described that way in any text that names him. This is not a criticism of the artistic tradition. It is simply a fact that the biblical text is deliberately, almost provocatively, silent about Gabriel's appearance. So where did the winged Gabriel come from? The answer takes us into the fascinating meeting point of early Christianity and the visual culture of the Roman Empire. Scholars of early Christian art, including Robin Jensen in her study of portraits of the divine in early Christianity, have noted that the earliest Christian artistic representations of angels, those from the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, generally did not include wings at all. These early angel figures were depicted as young men in white or light-colored garments, indistinguishable in form from human beings, consistent with the way angels appear in Genesis chapter 18 or in the book of Tobit. The addition of wings to angelic figures in Christian art appears to have gained momentum in the 4th century, roughly coinciding with Constantine's legalization of Christianity and the subsequent integration of Christian communities into the broader visual culture of the Roman world. Roman art was full of winged figures. The goddess Victoria, winged victories celebrating military triumphs. The god Mercury with his winged sandals and helmet. When Christian artists began working within this visual tradition, the wing became a natural way to signify beings from another order of existence, and it migrated onto the angels of Christian iconography, Gabriel. As the most frequently depicted angel in Christian narrative art, became its most winged exemplar. The Eastern Orthodox tradition developed its own highly codified approach to depicting Gabriel, and I find it genuinely fascinating how different it is from the free artistic imagination of the Western Renaissance tradition. Byzantine icon painting is not an exercise in artistic expression. It is a theological discipline, governed by specific rules about color, proportion, posture, and symbol that were understood to convey theological truth rather than aesthetic pleasure. The Painter's Manual of Dionysius of Fauna, compiled around 1730 CE and drawing on much earlier tradition, specifies with remarkable precision how Gabriel should be depicted. The golden halo that marks divine proximity, the staff or scepter signifying divine authority, the scroll or sphere representing the divine message carried. The faces of Byzantine angels, including Gabriel, are deliberately non-individualized. They are meant to suggest a being whose identity is entirely defined by relationship to God rather than by personal characteristics. In Eastern Orthodox theology, an icon is not merely a picture of Gabriel. When properly painted and properly venerated, it is understood as a genuine meeting point with the angelic reality it depicts. The white lily that appears in so many Western depictions of the Annunciation scene, Gabriel presenting a lily to Mary at the moment of his announcement, has a history that is almost entirely traditional and artistic rather than textual. The lily entered the iconography of the Annunciation through the medieval association of the flower with purity and virginity, and its specific connection to Mary's own purity made it a natural symbolic prop for Gabriel to carry in images of their encounter. By the time of the great Annunciation paintings of the Italian Renaissance, the lily had become essentially inseparable from Gabriel in this scene. You can see it in Fra Angelico's magnificent fresco at the convent of San Marco in Florence, painted between approximately 1438 and 1445, where Gabriel kneels before Mary with wings of extraordinary colour and detail, holding flowers that signal the nature of the one he addresses. The lily is beautiful and symbolically resonant, but it appears nowhere in Luke's account of the Annunciation. It is the gift of artistic tradition to the biblical story, an addition that tells us something true about how generations of believers understood Mary. Even though Gabriel's hands in the original text are carrying nothing but words. There is one moment in the development of Gabriel's visual tradition that I think particularly reveals how much human imagination has shaped this angelic figure. In Western medieval and Renaissance art, Gabriel is sometimes depicted not just as androgynous or male, but with distinctly feminine features, soft, curved, gentle, in a way that the surrounding culture coded as feminine. Art historians have long noted this characteristic in certain traditions of angelic depiction, and it reflects a theological intuition that heavenly beings are somehow beyond the categories of human gender, while still being depicted within a visual language that human beings can recognize and respond to. This is not a modern interpretation. It is built into the history of the art itself. The Gabriel who appears across the great churches and museums of Europe is a figure shaped not just by theology, but by the specific visual cultures, gender conventions, artistic training, and spiritual sensibilities of the communities that made those images. Each painting of Gabriel tells us as much about the painter and the patron and the century as it does about the being they were trying to capture. What I find most moving about this entire history of Gabriel's visual representation is what it reveals about human longing. Every artist who painted Gabriel, from the anonymous icon painter working in a Byzantine workshop, to Fra Angelico mixing his pigments in a monastery in Florence, to the sculptor shaping stone above a medieval cathedral door, was trying to do something that they already knew was impossible. They were trying to make visible what the biblical text deliberately left invisible. They were trying to give a body and a face to a being who, in the canonical text, is described only by what he says and does, and by the effect he has on the human beings he visits. That is a genuinely beautiful impulse, I think. The human refusal to leave mystery entirely unaddressed. The need to build a bridge between what can be known and what can only be imagined. The Gabriel of the great art tradition is not the Gabriel of the Bible, but he is the Gabriel of human longing, of centuries of people trying to picture grace, trying to see what divine communication looks like when it wears a face. Here is a thought I want to offer for your reflection as we draw toward the close of this chapter. The biblical text's silence about Gabriel's appearance is not, I believe, an oversight or a gap waiting to be filled. It may be, in its own way, a kind of wisdom. Gabriel, as the canonical text presents him, is defined entirely by function, by what he is sent to do, by the words he carries, by the effect those words have on the people who receive them. He identifies himself not by his appearance, but by his position. I stand in the presence of God. To give him a face and wings and a lily and a golden halo is to anchor him in the world of the visible, to make him manageable and comprehensible in a way that the text carefully avoids. The medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas, whom we will encounter again in a later chapter, spent considerable effort thinking about the nature of angelic being. And one of his arguments was precisely that angels do not have bodies in the ordinary sense. If Aquinas is right, then every painting of Gabriel is simultaneously a gesture toward truth and an admission of limitation. We can only picture what we know how to picture, even when the reality exceeds our pictures entirely. As we approach the end of this chapter, I want to leave you with one final image from the history of Gabriel's artistic representation. Among the most ancient surviving Christian images is a cycle of mosaics in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, she dating from the 5th century CE, some of the earliest surviving Christian monumental art. In these mosaics, which depict scenes from the Old Testament and from the Annunciation, the figure of Gabriel appears without wings. He is a young man in white, standing before the divine presence and before Mary, distinguished from ordinary human figures by his clothing and his bearing, but not yet by the great feathered wings that would become standard in later centuries. There is something in that wingless Gabriel, ancient, simple, defined only by his message and his presence, that feels closer to the Gabriel of Luke chapter 1 than almost anything the later artistic tradition produced. He came to Mary not with grandeur, but with words. He stood before her, not with overpowering display, but with a greeting and an announcement and a question received and a departure. Wings optional. Tonight, as you move into rest, let the long gallery of Gabriel's images pass gently through your mind. The Byzantine icon with its golden halo and its precise theology. Fra Angelico's luminous angel kneeling in a cloister garden. The wingless young man in a 5th century Roman mosaic. And behind all of them, beneath all of them, the Gabriel of the text itself, unnamed in appearance, defined only by the words he carries and the God he serves. In our next chapter, we will step into a very different tradition of Gabriel's portrayal. Not the world of Christian art and iconography, but the world of the Jewish rabbis, the Talmud, the Midrash, and the mystical tradition of Kabbalah. We will discover a Gabriel who teaches languages overnight, who suffers consequences for a failed mission, and who governs fire and the south wind. A Gabriel that is rich, surprising, and deeply human in its own very different way. Rest now. The story of this ancient messenger continues to unfold. There is a quality to the way the ancient rabbis told stories that I have always found deeply appealing. They were not, in the modern sense, systematic theologians building airtight logical frameworks. They were storytellers, questioners, arguers, people who believed that the sacred text was so alive and so generative that it could support an infinite number of questions, interpretations, and elaborations without ever being exhausted. The tradition of Midrash, which means something like seeking or searching out, is built on exactly this conviction. that the text of Scripture has not one surface meaning, but many layers, and that the job of the faithful reader is to keep digging, keep asking, keep imagining, until those deeper layers reveal themselves. Tonight, I want to walk with you into that tradition as it touches Gabriel's story, because what the rabbis said about this angel is remarkable, surprising, and in some ways more vivid and more human than anything the canonical biblical text records. I want to be clear with you from the start that what we are exploring here is not biblical narrative in the canonical sense. It is a Gadic tradition, the legendary and interpretive stories of the rabbinic world, which carry deep religious meaning for the Jewish community while being understood as distinct from the plain meaning of the sacred text itself. Let me begin with a story that I think captures the playful and profound spirit of the rabbinic imagination at its best. The Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin at folio 21, side B, tells us that Joseph, the same Joseph of the coat of many colors, the Joseph sold into Egypt by his brothers, needed to learn the 70 languages of the nations in a single night in order to stand before Pharaoh as a man of wisdom and authority. The problem was that Joseph, being a Hebrew, knew only Hebrew. The solution, according to this Talmudic passage, was Gabriel. The tradition holds that Gabriel appeared to Joseph in the night and taught him all 70 languages before morning came. I want you to picture that for a moment. Gabriel as tutor, as language teacher, working through the night with a young man who needed to be ready for one of the most important mornings of his life. It is a wonderfully specific and human image of angelic assistance, and it reveals something about how the rabbinic tradition understood Gabriel's function, not just as a deliverer of grand cosmic messages, but as a being who helps individual human beings become capable of what they are called to do. Gabriel, in this tradition, does not do the standing before Pharaoh for Joseph. He equips Joseph to do it himself. Then there is a story from the Talmudic tractate Yoma, the tractate concerned with the Day of Atonement, at folio 77, side A, that tells a very different kind of story about Gabriel. This passage recounts that Gabriel was given a specific task to perform, and that for some reason, the text is not entirely explicit about why, he did not carry it out promptly. As a result, he was smitten by a fire of fire, a punishment administered from within the divine realm itself. Now, I want to be careful here and transparent about what kind of text this is. This is a Gadic narrative. It is the rabbinic imagination working through theological questions about the nature of angelic obedience, about what happens when even the greatest of beings fails to execute a divine instruction perfectly. It is not historical record. It is not canonical scripture. But it is theologically serious in its own terms, because it raises a question that the canonical text carefully avoids. Can an angel fail? And if so, what does that mean about the nature of angelic service? The rabbis were willing to imagine that even Gabriel, the one who stands before God, was subject to consequences when his service fell short. That is a remarkably honest and humanizing theological imagination. The question of which angel wrestled with Jacob in the night beside the ford of the Jabbok, the famous story of Genesis chapter 32, verse 24, has generated considerable discussion across Jewish interpretation. The text of Genesis itself identifies the wrestler only as a man, and later in the same chapter, Jacob himself says he has seen God face to face. The prophet Hosea, in chapter 12, verse 4, refers to the wrestler as an angel. But which angel? The rabbinic text of Genesis Rabbah at section 78, verse 1, identifies the wrestler as Gabriel specifically. Though this identification is not universal within the rabbinic tradition, and should be understood as one interpretation, among several rather than a settled consensus. Other traditions identify the wrestler as Michael, or as the guardian angel of Esau, or as a figure representing something else entirely. What interests me about the Genesis Rabbah identification of Gabriel as Jacob's wrestling partner is what it implies about how the rabbis understood Gabriel's character. He is not merely a gentle messenger who delivers words and departs. He is, in this tradition, a being capable of physical engagement with a human being across a long and painful night. And the encounter ends not with Gabriel's victory, but with Jacob's, a human being who struggles with the divine and does not let go until he receives a blessing. The mystical dimension of Jewish Gabriel tradition takes us into the world of Kabbalah, the body of Jewish mystical thought that developed through the medieval period and reached a kind of literary crystallization in the Zohar, the great Kabbalistic text that emerged in 13th century Spain, traditionally attributed to the 2nd century Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, but understood by most modern scholars as a medieval composition. The Zohar, at Volume 1, Folio 119, Side B, places Gabriel within the framework of the divine chariot, the Merkabah, the mystical vision of God's throne described in Ezekiel, and identifies Gabriel with the left side of the divine structure and with the quality of din, which means judgment or strict justice. In the Kabbalistic map of divine qualities, the left side is the side of contraction, of boundaries, of the strict application of divine law, without mercy's softening. This is a very different Gabriel than the tender figure who addresses Mary's fear in Luke chapter 1. Though perhaps not entirely incompatible, a being who carries divine judgment with precision might also, when sent on a mission of grace, deliver that grace with a clarity and specificity that leaves no room for ambiguity. There are additional texts, including Numbers Rabbah chapter 2, verse 10, that associate Gabriel with fire and with the south in the directional cosmology of the ancient Near East. I want to pause here and offer a broader reflection on what all of these rabbinic traditions together are doing, because I think the cumulative picture is genuinely important. The canonical biblical text gives us Gabriel in 4 brief, concentrated appearances. The rabbinic tradition took that spare biblical Gabriel and expanded him into a being of enormous range. Language teacher, cosmic wrestler, angelic servant subject to consequences for failure, governor of fire and judgment, and the mystical left side of the divine throne. Why? I think the answer is that the rabbis were doing what communities of faith always do with figures that matter to them. They were pressing further, asking what else might be true, imagining Gabriel into the full complexity of their theological and human world. The questions they were working through are not trivial. Can the greatest of angelic beings fail? Does Gabriel have something like a will? What is the relationship between divine mercy and divine justice? And does Gabriel represent one more than the other? These are serious theological questions dressed in the clothing of story. The Talmudic sages were not naive. They knew the difference between the canonical text and their own elaborations. But they believed that sacred imagination, rigorously applied to a sacred text, could illumine truths that the text left in shadow. What I find particularly beautiful about the rabbinic Gabriel is the way these traditions place him in contact with specific human stories and specific human needs. He does not appear only in grand apocalyptic moments or at the hinge points of cosmic history. In the Talmudic imagination, he shows up in the night to teach a frightened young man the languages he needs. He wrestles in the dark with a patriarch who refuses to let go. He is subject to consequences when he falls short of his service. This is a Gabriel who inhabits the texture of human experience in a very particular way, not watching from a divine distance but embedded in the specific, sometimes messy, sometimes surprisingly mundane moments of human struggle and growth. The philosopher Maimonides, in his 12th century masterwork Guide for the Perplexed, took a very different approach to all of this, arguing in chapter 2, section 6, that angels are best understood not as personal beings, with individual characters, but as natural forces, the embodiment of specific divine activities rather than distinct personalities. It is a minority philosophical position within Jewish thought, but it represents the rationalist pole of a tradition that has always encompassed both the most concrete storytelling imagination and the most rigorous philosophical abstraction. There is something I want to note about the historical context that produced these rabbinic reflections, because context always matters in understanding how and why tradition develops the way it does. The Babylonian Talmud was compiled and edited over several centuries, with the main period of compilation falling around 500 CE. The rabbis who contributed to it were working in the aftermath of the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE, a catastrophe that, in many ways, echoed the Babylonian exile that had shaped the world of Daniel. The loss of the temple meant the loss of the central institution of Israelite religion, the place where the divine presence had been most concretely located, the place where Zechariah had encountered Gabriel. Into that loss, the rabbinic tradition built an extraordinarily rich literature of interpretation, memory, and imaginative elaboration. Gabriel, the being who had appeared in the temple and who was associated with divine communication at the most critical moments in Israel's history, naturally became a figure around whom that imaginative tradition clustered. He carried for the rabbis the memory of a world that had been lost and the hope of a God who had not finished speaking. As we draw toward the close of this chapter, let me offer you a thought that I keep returning to when I read the rabbinic Gabriel traditions alongside the canonical text. The Gabriel of the Bible is defined almost entirely by what he says, by the words he carries between God and human beings. The Gabriel of the rabbinic tradition is defined by what he does, by the tasks he performs, the struggles he engages in, the consequences he faces, the specific domains over which he has authority. These are not contradictory pictures. They are complementary ones, drawn by different communities, with different tools and different questions, all circling around the same fundamental mystery. The mystery of what kind of being stands closest to the divine presence, and what it looks like when that being moves into the human world. Neither the biblical text nor the rabbinic elaboration exhausts the question. Both are reaching towards something that neither can fully capture. Tonight, as you settle into rest, let the rabbinic Gabriel accompany you gently into sleep, the tireless language teacher working through the dark hours with Joseph, the wrestler who meets Jacob at the ford of the Jabbok, the being of fire and judgment who also governs paradise and its cherubim. These are stories told by people who loved their tradition deeply and pressed it hard, who believed that sacred imagination was not a departure from truth, but a way of reaching toward it. In our next chapter, we will cross into a third great tradition and meet Gabriel in his most dramatic, extra-biblical role of all, as Jibreel, the angel who carries the Quran to Muhammad in a cave on a mountain outside Mecca, and who becomes in Islamic theology the sole transmitter of God's final and complete revelation to humanity. It is a portrait of Gabriel unlike anything we have encountered so far, and it carries with it one of the most remarkable descriptions of an angelic being in all of world religious literature. Rest now. We will make that crossing together when you are ready. There is a mountain outside the city of Mecca in the Hejaz region of what is now Saudi Arabia, called Jabal al-Nur, the Mountain of Light. On its upper slopes, there is a small cave, barely large enough for a person to sit or lie down in. In the Islamic tradition, this cave, known as the Cave of Hira, is one of the holiest places on earth, because it is the place where, in the year 610 CE, a merchant named Muhammad ibn Abdullah came alone to pray and meditate, as he had done many times before. And it is the place where, according to Islamic belief, an encounter occurred that would shape the lives of over 1.5 billion people alive today, and countless millions across the centuries between then and now. The being who came to Muhammad in that cave is known in Arabic as Jibreel, and Jibreel is Gabriel. Tonight, I want to sit with you inside this tradition with genuine respect and genuine curiosity, because the Islamic portrait of Gabriel is not simply the biblical portrait borrowed and repeated. It is a distinct and fully developed theological vision of this same being, and it carries descriptions of angelic presence that are, in their scope and their specificity, unlike anything we have encountered in our story so far. I want to explore it with you carefully and honestly. Let me first situate you within the Islamic theological framework that makes Jibreel's role so extraordinary, because without that framework, the specifics of his function can seem merely miraculous, rather than theologically significant in the precise way Islamic tradition intends. Islam's central claim about the Quran is not simply that it is a holy book or a book of divine wisdom. The claim is more radical than that. The Quran, in Islamic theology, is the literal, verbatim word of God, Kalam Allah, the speech of God, transmitted without alteration or human interpretation through the angel Jibreel to the Prophet Muhammad over a period of approximately 23 years. This doctrine is called Wahi, divine revelation, and it is qualitatively different from the Jewish and Christian understandings of prophetic inspiration, in which the human personality and literary style of the prophet are understood to shape the form of the divine message. In Islamic theology, Jibreel does not inspire Muhammad. He transmits to him with perfect fidelity what God has spoken. The Quran itself states this directly in chapter 2, verse 97. Whoever is an enemy of Gabriel, God says, should know that it is Gabriel who has brought down the revelation upon your heart by God's permission. Jibreel is the channel. The Quran is what flows through him, unchanged. The account of the first revelation in the cave of Hira is preserved in extraordinary detail in the collection of prophetic traditions called the Hadith, specifically in the Sahih al-Bukhari, which is considered one of the most rigorously authenticated collections of Hadith in the Sunni tradition, at Volume 1. Number 1. The account as recorded there begins not with a vision or a dream, but with a physical and overwhelming experience. Jibreel, the tradition records, came to Muhammad and commanded him, read, or in the Arabic, Iqra. Muhammad, who by Islamic tradition was unlettered, responded that he could not read. Jibreel then seized him, the Arabic suggests a powerful embrace or compression, and held him so tightly that it was almost beyond endurance, then released him and commanded again, read. This happened 3 times. The 3rd time, Jibreel spoke the words that would become the opening of the 96th chapter of the Quran. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clinging substance. Read, and your Lord is the most generous. Muhammad, shaking and terrified, he fled the cave and ran home to his wife, Khadijah, saying he feared for his sanity. The experience was, by every account in the tradition, physically and psychologically overwhelming. It was not peaceful. it was not gentle. It was an encounter with a presence far beyond ordinary experience, and it began a mission that would last 23 years and produce one of the great literary and spiritual monuments of human history. The Quran's own references to Jibreel are relatively compact in number, but theologically enormous in significance. Surah 16, verse 102, identifies Jibreel as the Holy Spirit, Ruh al-Qudus, who brought down the revelation from God in truth to strengthen those who believe. This identification of Gabriel with the Holy Spirit is a distinctive Islamic theological usage of that title, and it differs significantly from the way Holy Spirit functions in Christian theology, where it refers to the third person of the Trinity. In the Islamic framework, Jibreel, as Ruh al-Qudus, is a created being, an extraordinarily exalted angelic being, but a creature nonetheless not divine in nature. Surah 26, verses 192 through 195 speaks of the trustworthy Spirit, descending with the revelation upon Muhammad's heart in the clear Arabic language. The phrase, the trustworthy Spirit, al-Ruh al-Amin, is understood in classical Islamic commentary as another designation for Jibreel, emphasizing the absolute fidelity with which he carries the divine message. And Surah 53, verses 5 and 6 describe a figure of mighty power who appeared to Muhammad, classical Islamic commentary, drawing on extensive interpretive tradition, identifies this figure as Jibreel in his true form. That brings me to what I think is one of the most remarkable descriptions of Gabriel anywhere in world religious literature. The description of Jibreel's true form as recorded in the Hadith collections. According to the Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 4, number 455, the Prophet Muhammad described seeing Jibreel in his true angelic form, and what he described is extraordinary. Jibreel, he said, had 600 wings. Each pair of wings was so vast that they filled the horizon. The sight was of a being so enormous, so cosmically scaled, that the human mind and body could barely sustain the vision of it. Now, this description is recorded within the Islamic tradition as a genuine account of a genuine experience. It is understood as reliable prophetic testimony about a real angelic being. I am presenting it here within its proper theological context, as a claim made by and within the Islamic tradition, not as something to be evaluated against other sources or reduced to comparative analysis. What I find genuinely striking about it, from the perspective of our story as a whole, is how it connects to the consistent pattern we have been tracing across every tradition, the pattern of Gabriel's presence being, in its fullness, overwhelming to human experience. Daniel fell to the ground. Zechariah was seized with terror. Muhammad fled the cave shaking. The being who carries the divine word is, in every tradition, she's something that the human body and mind can only partly contain. One dimension of the Islamic understanding of Jibreel that I want to share with you because it has sometimes been misunderstood in cross-religious conversation is the question of his relationship to the revelations given to earlier prophets. In Islamic theology, Jibreel is understood as the transmitter not only of the Quran to Muhammad, but of revelation to other prophets as well, including, in the Islamic framework, the prophets of the Hebrew Bible and Jesus, whom Islam recognizes as a prophet. The Torah given to Moses, the Psalms given to David, the Gospel given to Jesus, in Islamic tradition, these too are understood as originally divine revelations. Though Muslims believe the texts, as they now exist, have been altered from their original form over time. Jibreel, she in this view is the single angelic agent of all divine prophetic revelation, making his role in the Islamic theological framework even more comprehensive than his role in Judaism or Christianity. The Quran itself, in chapter 2, verses 97 and 98, places Jibreel in direct continuity with God's earlier messengers, identifying him as the conveyor of the divine word to God's chosen people across all of prophetic history. There is something I find deeply moving about the cross-traditional recognition of Gabriel that our story brings into view. In the synagogue and in the church and in the mosque, in three traditions that have sometimes been in bitter conflict with one another across the centuries, the same figure appears as a bearer of divine communication. His name changes: Gabriel, Gavriel, Jibreel. The theological frameworks that surround him differ profoundly in their understanding of his nature and his specific role, but across all three traditions, this same being occupies the same fundamental position, standing between the divine and the human, carrying what has been spoken in the highest place to the people who need to hear it in the lowest and most ordinary moments of their lives. The scholar Sayyid Hossein Nasr, in his monumental work, The Study Quran, reflects on this continuity with characteristic depth, noting that the great Abrahamic traditions share not only a common heritage, but a common understanding of revelation as a divine gift requiring a divine intermediary. Jibreel, in the Islamic tradition, is that intermediary at its most complete and most final expression. I want to be honest with you about something as we draw toward the close of this chapter, because I think intellectual honesty is one of the most important things I can offer in a story like this. The specific claims of each tradition about Gabriel, that he transmitted Daniel's visions, that he announced the birth of John and Jesus, that he delivered the Quran verbatim to Muhammad, are claims that the three traditions themselves evaluate very differently. For a Jewish reader, the Islamic claim about Jibreel and the Quran is simply not part of the sacred framework. For a Christian reader, Muhammad's prophetic mission is not recognized as a continuation of the biblical prophetic tradition. For a Muslim reader, the Christian understanding of Jesus as divine is a departure from pure monotheism that the Quran specifically addresses. These are genuine theological differences, and they are not resolved by the fact that all three traditions venerate a figure named Gabriel. I am not here to argue for any tradition's claims against another's. I am here to help you understand what each tradition believes, why it believes it, and what it reveals about the enduring human need to believe that the divine has not left us entirely without a word. As we move toward the end of this chapter, I want to offer you one final image to carry into rest. In the Islamic tradition, Jibreel's last delivery of revelation to Muhammad occurred near the end of the Prophet's life. The final verses of the Quran, as arranged in the canonical collection, carrying forward a message that had been transmitted over 23 years of encounter, hardship, community building, and unprophetic proclamation. When the revelation was complete, when God's speech had been fully transmitted through the angel to the prophet to the community, Jibreel's great mission was accomplished. There is a quietness to that completion, a sense of finality that mirrors the quietness of Gabriel's departure from Mary in Luke chapter 1, verse 38. He came, he spoke, the message was received, and then he was gone. In our next chapter, we will step back and look at the broader question of where Gabriel fits in the ancient religious world, at the traditions of divine messengers that preceded and surrounded the biblical and Quranic texts, and at what scholars have discovered about how the figure of the angelic messenger developed across the ancient Near East. It is a chapter about roots and connections, about the deep human instinct to believe that heaven and earth have not lost the ability to speak to one another. Rest now, and let the mountain of light be your last image before sleep. There is a question that I find myself returning to every time I study the ancient texts about Gabriel, and it is a question that scholars of religion have been wrestling with seriously for over a century. The question is this: when the ancient Israelites began to develop their understanding of beings like Gabriel, beings who stand between the divine and the human, carrying messages across that vast distance, were they working entirely from their own unique theological vision, or were they drawing on ideas and images already alive in the world around them? Tonight, I want to walk with you into that question, not to undermine anything we have explored together in the biblical text, but to set it in a wider frame, to show you the broader landscape of ancient religious imagination within which the figure of Gabriel took shape. This is the kind of exploration that I think enriches rather than diminishes the story, because understanding the world a figure emerges from helps us see that figure more clearly. So let me take you back, not to Babylon this time, or to Nazareth, or to a cave on a mountain outside Mecca, but to the deep archaeological and historical record of the ancient Near East, where the roots of angelic tradition reach down into soil far older than the biblical text itself. Let us begin with the oldest layer of the evidence, because it is genuinely remarkable. The ancient Mesopotamian religious texts, the literature of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon that predates the Hebrew Bible by many centuries, contain references to beings called Malaku, a word that scholars have noted is linguistically related to the Hebrew word malak, which is the standard Old Testament word for angel. These Malaku were understood as messenger beings, intermediaries between the divine world and the human world, carrying communications from the gods to human beings and from human beings back to the gods. There were also beings called Apkallu, divine sages, sometimes fish-shaped, sometimes human in form, who were sent from the divine world to teach human beings the arts of civilization. The biblical scholar John Day, in his study of the relationship between Yahweh and the gods of Canaan, has noted these structural parallels carefully, and scholars who study the ancient Near East broadly, including Karel van der Toorn and his colleagues in the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible, have mapped the conceptual territory these parallels occupy. What we find is not a direct line from Mesopotamian Malaku to the Hebrew Gabriel, but a shared conceptual vocabulary for divine intermediaries that the biblical tradition shares with its wider cultural world. The Ugaritic texts are perhaps even more directly relevant to our story, and I want to spend a moment with them because most people have never heard of Ugarit, and yet it is one of the most significant archaeological discoveries for understanding the biblical world. Ugarit was a city-state on the northern coast of modern Syria, and when archaeologists began excavating it in 1929, they found a library of clay tablets dating from approximately the 14th to the 12th century BCE, written in a Semitic language closely related to ancient Hebrew, full of myths, rituals, and theological texts about the Canaanite gods. Among the most significant features of Ugaritic religion, for our purposes, is the concept of the divine council, the Phr'Elem, the assembly of divine beings surrounding the high god El. This concept of a heavenly council, a gathering of divine beings in the presence of the chief deity, appears with striking similarity in the Hebrew Bible, in Psalm 82, verse 1, where God presides over a divine assembly, and in 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 19, where the prophet Micaiah sees the Lord sitting on his throne with all the host of heaven standing around him. The beings who populate that heavenly council in the biblical imagination are the ancestors, in a sense, of the great angels, including Gabriel. They are beings who stand in the divine presence, which is precisely how Gabriel identifies himself in Luke chapter 1, verse 19. Now I want to turn to a comparison that is more contested and requires more careful handling: the relationship between Jewish angelology and the religious tradition of ancient Persia called Zoroastrianism. When the Persian Empire under Cyrus II conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, and the Jewish exiles began their return to their homeland, they came into extended contact with Zoroastrian religious ideas for the first time. Zoroastrianism, which is among the oldest continuously practiced religions in the world, had developed a sophisticated theology of divine beings called the Amesha Sapentas, 6 holy immortals who emanate from Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity, and who each govern a specific domain of existence. They are neither gods themselves nor simple messengers. They are something in between, beings of a particular divine quality who mediate between the supreme God and the created world. Scholars like John Collins, whose work on Daniel we have visited in earlier chapters, have argued that Jewish contact with Zoroastrian thought during and after the Persian period was significant for the development of the elaborate angelic hierarchies we find in Second Temple literature. The parallels between the Amesha Spentas and the great archangels, including Gabriel with his specific domains and functions, are structural enough to deserve serious scholarly attention. But I want to be honest that direct influence, as opposed to parallel development, is genuinely debated. Similarity does not prove borrowing, and careful scholars on both sides of this question have made strong arguments. Here is what I think is the most important thing to hold on to as we navigate these comparisons, because it is easy to reach a conclusion in either direction that the evidence does not quite support. The existence of parallel concepts in surrounding ancient cultures does not mean that the biblical understanding of Gabriel is simply borrowed, derivative, or lacking its own distinctive character. Traditions influence one another, especially when they share a geographic and historical world, but they also transform what they borrow, reimagine it, and put it in service of their own theological vision. The Gabriel of the Book of Daniel is not a Mesopotamian Malaku dressed in Hebrew clothing. He is a figure shaped by the specific theological commitments of the Israelite tradition, the conviction that there is one God who is sovereign over all of history, whose messages to human beings are oriented toward understanding and redemption rather than divine self-interest, and whose chosen messengers consistently address human fear before they deliver divine content. Those specifics do not appear in the Mesopotamian or Ugaritic texts. They are distinctively biblical. The surrounding traditions tell us something about the conceptual language that ancient Israel shared with its neighbors. The way Israel used that language tells us something about what made Israel's vision different. I want to spend a moment with the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they offer us a window into the world of Jewish angelology at exactly the moment when the biblical tradition and the surrounding cultural influences were being synthesized into the form that would shape both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. Among the most remarkable of the Dead Sea Scroll texts for our purposes are the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, found at Qumran as text 4Q 400 through 4Q 407, and also at Masada, suggesting they were in wide use. These texts describe 13 Sabbath songs celebrating the angelic liturgy in heaven, the worship that goes on constantly before the divine throne, the prayers and praises of the celestial beings who never cease to stand in the divine presence. The angelic figures described in these songs are given no individual names, but the structure of the heavenly world they inhabit, layered, hierarchical, organized around the divine throne, is precisely the kind of heaven that the archangel traditions of First Enoch and later Christian and Islamic angelology presuppose. The Qumran community that preserved these texts also preserved fragments referencing Enochic traditions. The text scholars identify as 4Q227, confirming that ideas about named archangels, including Gabriel, were alive and active in their community. These texts do not prove Zoroastrian or Mesopotamian influence, but they do show us a Jewish community deeply invested in the reality of heavenly beings and their proximity to God. What I find genuinely fascinating about the Book of Jubilees, a Second Temple text dating from roughly the 2nd century BCE, accepted as canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and regarded as significant but non-canonical by other traditions, is the way it situates angels within the very structure of creation itself. Jubilees describes what it calls the angels of the presence, beings who stand closest to God from the very beginning, present at the creation of the world and involved in its ongoing governance. Gabriel is not named explicitly in all parts of this text, but the category of angels of the presence, of beings whose defining characteristic is their proximity to the divine, is precisely the category that Gabriel places himself in when he speaks to Zechariah in Luke chapter 1. This language of standing in the presence, of being defined by divine proximity rather than by specific power or domain, appears across Jewish texts of this period and forms one of the most consistent threads connecting the many different portraits of Gabriel that we have been exploring across these chapters. It suggests that whatever cultural influences shape the development of Jewish angelology, the theological core that most mattered to the biblical tradition was not angelic power, but angelic nearness, not what these beings could do, but where they stood. Now, I want to be straightforward with you about something that I think matters for intellectual honesty in a story like this. The question of whether Gabriel, as a named, distinct, angelic being with specific functions and a specific role in cosmic history, owes his existence to Mesopotamian, Ugaritic, Persian, or some other external influence, or whether he emerged from within the Israelite tradition's own theological development, cannot be definitively answered with the evidence currently available to us. The archaeological record gives us parallels, gives us structural similarities, gives us a shared conceptual vocabulary across the ancient Near East. What it cannot give us is a direct line of transmission from any specific external tradition to the biblical text. The honest scholarly position, as represented by careful researchers like Karel van der Toorn, is one of genuine uncertainty, acknowledging influence while resisting overstatement, noting parallels while honoring distinctiveness. I think that honest uncertainty is actually one of the most interesting things about this area of study. It keeps the question alive. It keeps us reading and thinking rather than filing the material away in a category we already understand. As we draw toward the close of this chapter, let me offer a reflection that I hope feels integrating rather than reductive. Gabriel's story, as we have traced it together across cultures and texts and centuries, is embedded in the broadest possible human question. The question of whether the universe is inhabited by purpose, whether something moves between the place where all things originate and the place where individual human lives are lived. Every culture in the ancient Near East found ways to answer yes to that question, and they populated the space between heaven and earth with beings of varying description and function. Israel answered that question with a particular insistence on the singularity of God and the purposefulness of divine communication. And within that framework, Gabriel emerged as the figure most consistently associated with the movement of divine understanding toward human comprehension. Whether that specific portrait was shaped by Mesopotamian loan concepts, or Persian angelic frameworks, or Ugaritic divine council theology, or some combination of all three, What remained distinctively itself across all the influences was the conviction that when God speaks, the speaking is oriented toward human understanding, human redemption, and human response. Tonight, as you settle into rest, let this wider frame sit gently around everything we have explored together. Gabriel did not emerge into a world without precedent. He stepped into a vast, ancient, richly imagined cosmos, already populated with divine intermediaries and heavenly messengers and beings of the presence. And within that world, across that long history of human longing for connection with the divine, his story took its specific shape: the interpreter, the one who lifts the fallen, the one who says, "Do not be afraid," before he says anything else. In our next chapter, we will move from these deep historical and archaeological questions into something much more personal, into the world of feast days and prayers and liturgical devotion, into the communities across centuries who have not just studied Gabriel, but have actively venerated him, called on his name, and built their most sacred spaces in his honor. It is a chapter about what it looks like when theology becomes devotion, when intellectual conviction becomes lived love. Rest now. The story continues in the warmth of the devotional tradition. There is a difference between knowing about someone and actually honoring them, between understanding a historical figure intellectually and building your life around their memory with the kind of love that expresses itself in festivals and prayers and buildings of stone. Tonight, I want to move from the scholarly and historical dimensions of Gabriel's story into something warmer and more personal, into the world of lived religious devotion, where Gabriel is not an object of study, but a figure of active spiritual significance, present in the rhythm of the liturgical year, named in prayers offered before sleep and at the start of difficult days, and honored in churches and cathedrals and chapels built across centuries on every inhabited continent. This is the Gabriel that billions of people have actually lived with, not the Gabriel of the academy or the archaeological dig, but the Gabriel of the candle lit in his honor, the feast day observed with joy, the prayer whispered in the dark by someone who needed to believe that heaven's messenger might still be listening. I want to walk with you through that tradition tonight, with the same care and honesty we have brought to everything else in this story. Let us begin with the liturgical calendar, because it is the most structured expression of how the Christian traditions have organized their devotion to Gabriel across the year. In the Roman Catholic Church, Gabriel shares his feast day with the two other named archangels of the Christian tradition, Michael and Raphael. The day is September 29th, celebrated in the Roman martyrology as the Feast of the Archangels, and it is known in the English-speaking world by the old name Michaelmas, which gives you a sense of how long this tradition has been running. The pairing of Gabriel with Michael and Raphael on a single feast day is theologically deliberate. It reflects the Church's understanding of the archangels as a coherent company of heavenly servants, distinct in their roles but united in their origin and their orientation toward God and toward human beings. Gabriel brings the word. Michael leads the heavenly armies. Raphael, whose name means God heals, and who appears in the book of Tobit, brings divine healing to human suffering. Together, they represent three fundamental modes of divine engagement with the human world: communication, protection, and healing. The Eastern Orthodox traditions approach the commemoration of Gabriel with a different calendar structure, and the differences are worth noting because they reveal different theological emphases. The Orthodox churches celebrate Gabriel on March 26th, the day after the Feast of the Annunciation on March 25th, which commemorates Gabriel's appearance to Mary in Luke chapter 1. Placing Gabriel's feast day immediately after the Annunciation is a beautiful liturgical gesture. It honors the messenger in the immediate wake of celebrating the message, acknowledging that the announcement of the Incarnation cannot be properly commemorated without also commemorating the one who delivered it. The Orthodox churches also observe a second feast of Gabriel on November 8th as part of the synaxis of the archangels, a collective commemoration of all the great angels. In Byzantine liturgical prayer, Gabriel is addressed with remarkable specificity. He is called the angel of the Incarnation, the herald of the eternal King, the one who serves the mystery of the divine plan from age to age. These are not casual honorifics. They are theologically considered titles that locate Gabriel within the specific narrative of God's engagement with the world. I want to share with you something about the Coptic Orthodox Church and the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, because these ancient African Christian communities have a devotion to Gabriel that is, in many ways, more intensive and more structurally integrated into daily religious life than what is found in Western Christianity. The Coptic Orthodox Church, which traces its origins to the evangelist Mark, and has maintained an unbroken tradition of Christian worship in Egypt since the 1st century CE, commemorates Gabriel on the 22nd of Kayak, a date that falls around the end of December or beginning of January in the Gregorian calendar. In the Coptic tradition, Gabriel is particularly honored as the patron of messengers and of divine communication, and his commemoration is woven into the rhythm of the liturgical year with a care that reflects centuries of sustained devotion. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which as we have noted considers 1st Enoch canonical scripture, carries a devotion to Gabriel that may be the most intensive of any Christian community in the world. Churches in Ethiopia are dedicated to Gabriel in great numbers. Monthly feast days in his honor are observed with genuine communal celebration. His role as the angel of the Annunciation, as the one who brought the message of Christ's coming into the world, gives him a particular prominence in a tradition that holds the Incarnation at the very center of its theological imagination. Now, I want to be honest with you about a detail that sometimes gets repeated in popular accounts of Gabriel without sufficient precision, and I think you deserve the accurate version rather than a simplified one. It is commonly said that Pope Pius XII declared Gabriel the patron saint of telecommunications and broadcasters. The historical record confirms that Gabriel has indeed been associated with this patronage in modern Catholic tradition, given his role as God's messenger, and this is a theologically coherent association. Since the transmission of important communications from one place to another is precisely what Gabriel does in every one of his canonical appearances. However, I want to note that the specific details of the papal declaration and its exact date require verification that is beyond what I can confirm with full certainty tonight. And I prefer to tell you that honestly, rather than state a specific date or document that I cannot fully verify. What I can tell you with confidence is that the association between Gabriel and modern communications is real, is recognized in Catholic devotional tradition, and makes a kind of poetic sense that I find genuinely beautiful. The ancient messenger of divine communication, being honored as patron of the technologies through which human beings now carry messages across the planet at the speed of light. The tradition of angelic intercessory prayer, the practice of asking angels to pray on one's behalf, or to carry one's prayers to God, is one of the most beautiful and also one of the most theologically contested aspects of the devotional life that has grown up around Gabriel. In Catholic and Orthodox tradition, this practice is rooted in the understanding that the saints and angels who stand before God are able to intercede for those still living on earth. That Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, can carry human need into that presence just as he carries divine messages outward from it. The liturgical prayers addressed to Gabriel in both traditions are careful to distinguish between the honor given to an angel and the worship given to God alone, a distinction that has mattered enormously in Christian theology since at least the early centuries. Pope Leo XIII composed the famous Prayer to St. Michael in 1886, a prayer that became widely used in Catholic worship and that represents this tradition of angelic intercession at its most structured. Gabriel has his own intercessory prayers within the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, though they are less universally known than the Michael prayer. Protestant traditions, drawing on the verse in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5, that there is one mediator between God and man, generally do not pray to or through angels, directing all prayer to God directly. This is a genuine theological difference that deserves to be stated clearly. There is something I find deeply moving about the way different communities across centuries have found their own specific reasons to love Gabriel. For Ethiopian Orthodox Christians, he is the herald of the Incarnation, the one who brought the news that changed everything, and whose message is worth commemorating every month, because it is the message that the entire faith rests on. For Coptic Christians, he is the patron of communication, a figure who stands for the conviction that important things can travel from where they originate to where they are needed without being lost or corrupted along the way. For Catholic Christians observing Michaelmas on September 29th, he is part of a company of heavenly servants who represent the full range of divine care for the human world. For Orthodox Christians who honor him on March 26th, he is the messenger whose words to Mary set in motion the great mystery that the entire liturgical year is oriented around. Each of these portraits is drawn from the same 4 canonical appearances, the same 2 chapters of Daniel, and the same chapter of Luke. But each community has found in those sparse and luminous texts something that speaks to its own deepest needs and its own deepest convictions about what God is like and how God moves in the world. I want to offer a thought here that I think honors both the devotional tradition and the theological complexity we have been sitting with throughout this story. The practice of venerating Gabriel, giving him a feast day, addressing prayers to him, building churches in his honor, commemorating him monthly, is, at its root, an act of gratitude for the messages he carried. It is the human instinct to honor not just the message, but the messenger, to recognize that communication is never purely informational, but always relational, always carried by someone from somewhere to someone. When a community lights a candle on September 29th, or gathers for the synaxis of the archangels on November 8th, or celebrates the feast of Gabriel on the 22nd of Kayak, they are doing something that connects them across centuries to Daniel prostrate on the ground beside the Ulai Canal, to Zechariah shaking in the holy place, to Mary troubled and thinking in a small room in Nazareth. They are saying the messages that changed everything were carried by someone, that someone is worth remembering, that someone perhaps is still listening. As we draw toward the end of this chapter, let me say something honest about the diversity of Christian and Jewish responses to the devotional tradition around Gabriel. Not every community that reads the same Bible arrives at the same practice. A Reformed Protestant Christian reading the same Luke chapter 1 that an Ethiopian Orthodox Christian reads may honor Gabriel's role deeply in their theological understanding, while choosing not to observe a feast day or address a prayer to him. A Jewish reader who finds in the rabbinic stories about Gabriel a rich imaginative tradition may engage with those stories as a Gada, as sacred narrative, without the specific liturgical structures of the Christian calendar. These are not failures of faith. They are different expressions of the common human need to respond to what is sacred, and they are shaped by theological commitments that deserve respect on their own terms. The devotional tradition around Gabriel is vast and beautiful and worth knowing, whether or not you participate in any part of it. Tonight, as you rest, let the image of all these candles hold you gently. The candles lit in Ethiopian churches every month in Gabriel's honor. The feast day prayers rising from monasteries in September. The Byzantine icon glowing in a corner of an Orthodox home. The Coptic commemoration offered at the turn of the year. All of it reaching back toward the same 4 appearances, the same 2 words, I am Gabriel, spoken in the dark and burning holy place, and in a small room in Galilee, and still echoing, centuries later, in the prayers of communities on every continent. In our next chapter, we will move from the outer world of liturgy and devotion into the inner world of theology, into the question of what Gabriel's story reveals about how God speaks, about the pattern of divine communication that runs like a thread through every appearance Gabriel makes in the canonical text. It is a quieter chapter, more reflective, and I think it may be the most personally meaningful chapter of all. Rest now. There is one more set of deep questions ahead, and then we will begin the gentle descent toward the end of our story. Tonight, I want to try something a little different. Rather than moving through new territory or introducing new texts and traditions, I want to slow down and look back with you across everything we have explored together in this long story. I want to ask what Gabriel's appearances, taken together as a whole pattern, reveal about something that I think is one of the most important questions any human being can sit with. The question of how God speaks. Not whether God speaks. That is a question each person must answer for themselves, in the quiet of their own experience and conviction. But if we take the biblical texts we have been exploring as our starting point and ask what they, together, suggest about the nature of divine communication, I think Gabriel's story gives us an answer that is both specific and surprising. The answer is not what you might expect. It is not about thunder or fire or overwhelming supernatural display, though Gabriel's presence certainly overwhelms the people he visits. The answer, I think, is something quieter and more personal than that. And I want to walk through it with you carefully tonight, because I believe it is worth the time. Let us start with the pattern of Gabriel's appearances in the canonical text, because I think the pattern itself is the first and most important thing it tells us. We have 4 named appearances across the entire Protestant biblical canon. Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 9, Luke chapter 1 with Zechariah, and Luke chapter 1 with Mary. And when you lay these 4 appearances side by side and look at them together, something remarkable comes into focus. In every single one, Gabriel is sent to a person who is already in a state of confusion, fear, or overwhelming experience that exceeds ordinary human comprehension. Daniel is trying to understand a vision that terrifies him and makes him ill. Daniel is praying with extraordinary urgency and grief over the state of his people. Zechariah is startled in the holiest room in the world by a presence he did not expect. Mary is troubled and wondering at a greeting she cannot make sense of. Gabriel does not arrive into moments of calm understanding and spiritual clarity. He arrives every single time into the middle of human overwhelm. I find that pattern genuinely significant, and I think the biblical scholar Gordon Fee captured something true when he wrote in How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, that the patterns of Scripture are often as theologically meaningful as the individual statements within it. Look at what Gabriel does first in every one of these encounters, and it is consistent enough to be called a signature. He addresses fear. In Daniel chapter 8, verse 17, he approaches Daniel, who has fallen prostrate in terror, and speaks to him. In Luke chapter 1, verse 13, his very first words to Zechariah are, "Do not be afraid." In Luke chapter 1, verse 30, his first words to Mary are, "Do not be afraid, Mary." Before the message comes, the fear is acknowledged. Before the content is delivered, the condition of the receiver is addressed. I find this detail so humanly significant that I want to sit with it for more than a moment. Gabriel carries messages of cosmic scope, the rise and fall of empires, the birth of the one who will reign on David's throne forever, the inauguration of the new prophetic age. These are not small matters, and yet the first thing Gabriel does every time is look at the human being in front of him and say, "I see that you are afraid." We are going to deal with that first. There is a pastoral quality to Gabriel that I think gets lost when we focus only on the grandeur of his announcements. Now let me draw your attention to something else that Gabriel consistently does across his 4 canonical appearances, something that the scholar N.T. Wright, in his work The New Testament and the People of God, would call a pattern of divine initiative. In every encounter, Gabriel identifies himself as sent, as acting under a commission from outside himself, as a messenger whose authority derives entirely from the one who dispatched him. In Daniel chapter 8, a voice from the Ulai says, "Gabriel, make this man understand. He is sent." In Daniel chapter 9, verse 23, Gabriel says, "As soon as you began to pray, a command was given. He is sent." In Luke chapter 1, verse 19, he identifies himself as one who stands in the presence of God and has been sent to speak. In Luke chapter 1, verse 26, the text says simply that he was sent by God to Nazareth. 4 appearances, 4 sendings. Gabriel is never self-dispatched, never acting on his own initiative, never arriving because he decided to come. He comes because something beyond him has moved, has spoken. She has decided that this particular human being, in this particular moment of need, should receive a message. The initiative is always divine. The direction is always from the eternal toward the immediate. And the messenger himself is, in every sense, defined by the one who sends him. Here is what I think this pattern reveals about how the biblical text understands divine communication. It is always initiated from outside the human situation. It always takes human need and human fear seriously enough to address them before delivering content. It always moves toward understanding, toward making something comprehensible that was beyond comprehension. And it always requires a response. Gabriel does not simply drop a message and disappear without any concern for whether the recipient has received it. He lifts Daniel to his feet. He speaks to Zechariah until the message is complete. He waits for Mary to ask her question, and then he answers it. And in each case, what he is ultimately waiting for is not passive reception, but active human response. Daniel returning to the king's business, Zechariah serving out his temple duties, Mary speaking her fiat. The message is not complete until it has been received and responded to. That is, I think, a profound and beautiful theology of communication, and it is encoded in the pattern of Gabriel's appearances with remarkable consistency. I want to bring in a voice from the theological tradition that I think illumines this pattern beautifully, because I think it deserves to be named explicitly. The Swiss theologian Karl Barth, in his Church Dogmatics, in the section on the doctrine of creation, she argued that angels are what he called ministering spirits in a very specific sense, beings whose entire existence is oriented toward the service of the Word of God, whose being is entirely functional, entirely in service of something beyond themselves. Barth was drawing on the language of Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, which describes angels as ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation. And he was taking that functional description with absolute seriousness. In Barth's reading, Gabriel does not have a private life, a personal agenda, a story that runs parallel to his angelic mission. His being is his mission. He exists to carry the word of God toward human beings who need to receive it. I find this a compelling way to understand what the canonical text actually shows us about Gabriel. And every detail we have, his name, his self-identification, his consistent behavior across 4 appearances, is consistent with a being whose entire identity is defined by the relationship between the one who sends and the one who receives. He is the middle term in an act of divine communication. Let me now draw your attention to what I consider one of the most remarkable small details in Gabriel's canonical story, because it appears in Luke chapter 1, verse 19. And I think it carries enormous theological weight that its brevity tends to obscure. When Zechariah questions Gabriel's announcement, Gabriel does not respond with anger or a display of power. He responds by identifying himself in the most precise possible terms. I am Gabriel, and I stand in the presence of God. The authority of everything Gabriel says rests on those 2 statements alone. His name, which means God is my strength. His position in the presence of God. He offers Zechariah no other credential, no other argument, no other reason to believe. The message is reliable because the messenger stands in the presence of the one who cannot speak falsely. And Gabriel himself is who he is because of where he stands. There is a beautiful circular completeness to this self-identification. Gabriel's strength is God. Gabriel stands before God. Gabriel's words come from God, and therefore Gabriel's words carry God's strength. The messenger is indistinguishable from the source of the message in a way that is, when you sit with it, genuinely moving. One more thread I want to pull from the pattern of Gabriel's appearances before we begin to close this chapter. Daniel, chapter 9, verse 23, records Gabriel saying to Daniel that he is highly esteemed, the Hebrew shamudo, the word of precious regard. The same word appears again in Daniel chapter 10, verses 11 and 19, where a different heavenly figure addresses Daniel with the same designation. There is something in this specific language of personal regard, of the divine world knowing and valuing this individual human being, that I think is worth sitting with quietly. Gabriel is not delivering an impersonal transmission of information to an undifferentiated recipient. He is speaking to Daniel specifically, a person whom the divine world regards with particular care. And when Gabriel speaks to Mary, "Do not be afraid, Mary, you have found favor with God," the same quality of personal, specific, knowing regard is present. Gabriel's appearances suggest a divine communication that is not broadcast but addressed, not generic but personal, not information transmitted to whoever happens to be listening, but a message crafted for a specific human being in a specific moment of their specific life. As we move toward the close of this chapter, I want to offer you a reflection on what all of this means for the way we might understand our own relationship to whatever is true and deep and generative in the world. The pattern that Gabriel's story traces across the biblical text is a pattern of divine persistence, of something that keeps trying to reach human beings, keeps sending messages across the vast distance between the eternal and the immediate, keeps addressing fear before delivering content, keeps waiting for human response before considering the communication complete. Whether you read that pattern as a description of God's actual relationship with the human world, or as a profound human theological vision of what such a relationship should look like, I think the pattern itself is beautiful and worth holding. It suggests a universe in which the direction of communication is not only upward, human beings crying out into silence, but also downward, inward, toward the specific and frightened and overwhelmed human being who is trying to understand something too large for ordinary comprehension. Tonight, let this pattern rest gently in your mind as you drift towards sleep. Gabriel, she sent 4 times across the canonical biblical record, each time addressing fear first, each time oriented entirely toward understanding, each time waiting for human response, each time defined not by his own nature, but by his relationship to the one who sent him. In our next chapter, we will push even deeper into the theological question that Gabriel's story raises, but never quite answers in the canonical text. The question of what kind of being an angel actually is, whether Gabriel has something like a will, whether angels experience anything, and what 2,000 years of Christian theological reflection has had to say about the nature of angelic existence. It is a philosophical chapter, quiet and contemplative, and it will take us to the very edge of what human thought can reach. Rest now. We are close to the end of our story, and the final questions are the deepest ones. There is a kind of question that human beings have always loved to ask. Questions that begin at the edge of what we know and reach outward into what we can only imagine. Tonight, I want to sit with you at exactly that kind of edge. We have followed Gabriel across thousands of years of human history, through 3 world religions, through canonical scripture and extra-canonical tradition, and rabbinic storytelling, and Islamic theology, and the long history of Christian art and devotion. We have watched him lift Daniel from the ground, announce John's birth to a terrified old priest, speak the most world-changing greeting in human history to a young woman in Nazareth, and carry the Quran to Muhammad in a cave on a mountain. But through all of that, one question has been quietly present underneath everything we have explored, and tonight I want to bring it fully into the light. The question is this: what kind of being is Gabriel? Does he experience anything? Does he choose to obey, or is obedience simply what he is? Does he have something like a will, something like a self, something like an inner life? These are questions that the biblical text does not answer directly, and yet they are questions that some of the greatest minds in human history have spent enormous energy working through. I want to share some of what they found. Let us begin with what the canonical text does say, because even in its brevity, it offers us more than we might at first realize. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, describes angels as a category, as ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation. That is a functional definition, oriented entirely toward what angels do rather than what they are. Psalm 103, verses 20 and 21, gives us a slightly different angle, describing angels as those who do his bidding and obey his word. And that verb, obey, is interesting because it implies the capacity for something other than obedience, even if angels never exercise that capacity. You do not typically describe a rock as obeying the law of gravity, because a rock has no capacity to do otherwise. The fact that the psalmist uses the language of obedience for angels suggests, at least in this text's imagination, that angelic compliance with the divine will involve something more than pure mechanical necessity. And then there is Luke chapter 1, verse 19, where Gabriel identifies himself with the remarkable phrase, "I stand in the presence of God." Present tense, continuous action, a posture of ongoing relationship, rather than simply a mechanical assignment being executed. These are thin threads of textual evidence, but they are what the canonical text actually gives us to work with. Now let me take you into the world of scholastic theology. because it is here that the question of angelic nature was worked through with the most rigorous intellectual care in the history of Christian thought. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Dominican theologian, whose Summa Theologiae remains one of the most comprehensive works of systematic theology ever written, devoted an entire section of that enormous work, questions 50 through 64 of the first part, to the question of angelic nature. What Aquinas concluded is worth sharing, because it is both philosophically rigorous and strangely beautiful. Angels, Aquinas argued, are purely intellectual beings. They have intellect and they have will, but they do not have bodies in the ordinary physical sense. They are not limited by matter, by space, by the sequential passage of time in the way embodied creatures are. An angel, in Aquinas' account, does not move through space the way a human being does. It is simply present at one location and then present at another, without traversing the distance in between. An angel does not reason through a problem step by step the way a human mind does. It understands things through direct intellectual intuition, without the laborious process of inference that characterizes human thought. Each angel, Aquinas famously argued, is its own species, not a member of a class of beings, but a unique kind of being in itself, because without bodies to individuate them, two angels cannot differ the way two human beings of the same species differ. Gabriel, in this framework, is not one member of an angelic type. Gabriel is a type unto himself. I want to share something about Aquinas' treatment of Gabriel specifically, because it follows from these general principles in a way that I find genuinely illuminating for our story. If Gabriel is a purely intellectual being with will and intellect, then his decision to obey the divine command, to accept the mission of going to Daniel, to Zechariah, to Mary, is a genuine act of will, not a mechanical response. Aquinas argued that angels make their fundamental moral choice for or against God in a single, definitive act, because their intellect, operating without the limitations of time and sequential reasoning, grasps everything at once. This is why, in Aquinas' framework, the fall of the rebellious angels was permanent. They made their choice with full angelic understanding, in a single act that defined them forever. And by the same logic, Gabriel's faithful standing before God, his willing orientation toward the divine presence, his execution of each mission with apparent care and precision, these are expressions of a permanent and definitive angelic choice. Gabriel obeys not because he cannot do otherwise, but because his will, in its one great defining act, chose alignment with the God in whose presence he stands. I find something genuinely moving about that picture. Not a mechanical messenger, but a being of genuine will and genuine choice, whose faithfulness is chosen rather than compelled. John Calvin, who approached almost everything differently from Aquinas, and who is worth hearing on this question precisely because his differences are so sharp, wrote in his Institutes of the Christian Religion, in Book 1, Chapter 14, that the entire question of angelic nature should be approached with extreme caution and humility. Calvin's concern was pastoral as much as theological. He worried that the elaborate medieval angelology, with its hierarchies and its categories and its careful philosophical distinctions, was leading Christians away from the biblical text and into speculation that served curiosity rather than faith. Let us not indulge in curious and unprofitable questions, he wrote, or words to that effect. He wanted his readers to focus on what the text actually says about angels, rather than on what human reason might build above and beyond that foundation. What Calvin does affirm clearly, drawing on Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14, is that angels are servants, beings whose purpose is defined by their relation to human beings in the economy of salvation, and that this service is what the Christian should be interested in, not the metaphysics of angelic constitution. I respect Calvin's restraint, even while finding Aquinas' exploration genuinely enriching, and I think both voices together represent something healthy. The instinct to ask deep questions held in tension with the instinct to stay close to what can actually be known. Now I want to return to a detail from the Talmudic tradition that we explored in an earlier chapter, because in this context it takes on new significance. The story in Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Yoma, folio 77, of Gabriel being smitten for a delay in carrying out his assignment is, from a strictly canonical biblical perspective, a Gaddic narrative rather than theological statement. But it raises in story form exactly the question we have been exploring in philosophical form, the question of whether Gabriel can fail, whether he is subject to anything like consequence or limitation, whether his will is capable of something less than perfect execution of divine instruction. Aquinas would say that Gabriel, having made his defining angelic choice, is incapable of the kind of moral failure that would constitute rebellion. But he might also acknowledge that within faithful service, there is room for what we might call imperfect execution, for something like a delay or a mismatch between the divine command and the angelic response. The rabbinic story does not resolve the philosophical question, but it asks it with the kind of imaginative honesty that I have come to admire in the tradition that produced it. What about the question of whether Gabriel experiences anything? Whether there is something it is like to be Gabriel, to stand before God, to be sent on mission after mission across the centuries and the civilizations? This is a question that the canonical text does not answer, that Aquinas approaches cautiously, and that Calvin would probably tell us not to ask. But I want to sit with it for just a moment, because I think it is worth sitting with, even if it cannot be answered. Gabriel, in Luke chapter 1, says he stands in the presence of God. He brings the news to Zechariah that Elizabeth will bear a son and describes this news as good news. The Greek word euangelion, the word from which we get gospel. Gabriel identifies the news he carries as good. Whether that identification involves anything like the experience of joy that a human being might feel at good news, whether Gabriel knows something like the feeling of carrying a gift to someone who needs it, the text does not say. What the text does say, by its careful attention to Gabriel's specific words and actions in each encounter, is that Gabriel is not a machine executing code. He addresses fear. He offers care. He waits for response. Whatever is happening inside Gabriel, if anything is happening inside Gabriel, his external behavior is consistent with a being who takes the situation of each human being. He visits with genuine seriousness. The Eastern Orthodox tradition, which has its own rich theological approach to these questions, offers a perspective that I find beautifully distinct from both Aquinas and Calvin. Gregory Palamas, the 14th century Byzantine theologian, whose thought remains foundational for Eastern Orthodox theology, drew a distinction between the divine essence, which is absolutely unknowable and inaccessible to any created being, and the divine energies, which are the real and genuine self-communication of God that created beings, including angels, can genuinely participate in. In this framework, Gabriel's standing in the presence of God is not a matter of proximity to an essence that remains forever inaccessible, but genuine participation in the divine energies, a real communion with what God actually gives of himself. Gabriel, in the Palamite framework, is genuinely alive in a way that is shaped by that communion. His being is not just functional, but participatory. He shares in something of the divine life and then carries it outward toward the human world. It is a beautiful picture, and it connects Gabriel's self-identification, I stand in the presence of God, to something richer and more relational than a simple statement of location. As we draw toward the close of this chapter, I want to offer you a thought that brings together the philosophical and the personal. The great theologians who have thought most carefully about angelic nature, Aquinas, Calvin, Gregory Palamas, Barth, all agree on one thing, despite their many differences. Whatever angels are in their inner being, whatever kind of existence they have, whatever they experience or do not experience, they exist in relation to God and in relation to human beings. And those two relationships define everything that matters about them. Gabriel is not intelligible apart from the God who sends him, or apart from the human beings to whom he is sent. His identity, in the fullest sense, is relational. And perhaps that is the deepest thing Gabriel's story tells us about angelic being. Not that angels are powerful, or wise, or beautiful, or numerous, though all of those things may be true, but that they exist as the embodiment of divine relationship in motion, as the shape that divine care takes when it moves from the eternal toward the immediate. Tonight, as you move into rest, let these deep questions settle gently rather than demanding resolution. We have sat at the edge of what human thought can reach. Aquinas building his elegant philosophical architecture of angelic intellect and will, and Calvin calling us back to the simplicity of what the text actually says. The Eastern Orthodox tradition offering the beauty of divine participation. The rabbinic tradition asking honest and imaginative questions through the medium of story. None of them have exhausted Gabriel. None of them have said the final word. And perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Perhaps a being who stands in the presence of the God who cannot be fully known is a being who will always exceed what our categories can capture. In our final chapter, we will bring this entire story to its close, not with answers, but with something I think is more valuable. A quiet, honest reflection on what Gabriel's enduring presence across thousands of years of human history might mean, and what the messenger, without a monument, has left behind in the hearts of the people who have heard his story. Rest now. One chapter remains, and it is the gentlest one of all. We have come a long way together in this story, from the banks of the Ulai Canal in ancient Elam to a small room in Nazareth, from the cave on Jabal al-Nur outside Mecca to the great icon painting workshops of Byzantium, from the Talmudic academies of Babylon to the liturgical calendars of churches on every continent. Tonight, I want to bring us gently home, not with a summary, because I think you have held enough information over these many hours, and the mind that approaches sleep deserves rest more than recapitulation. What I want to do instead is sit with you quietly and reflect on what this story, taken as a whole, I might mean not just as a piece of ancient history or comparative religion, but as something that has kept calling human beings back, across thousands of years and through the most profound changes in culture and civilization, because something in it continues to feel true and necessary and alive. Gabriel never wrote anything down. He built no monument. He left no institution in his wake. He simply came, spoke, and left. And yet here we are, thousands of years later, still telling his story. I find that remarkable, and I want to sit in that remarkableness with you for a while before we rest. Let me begin with the ending, or rather, with the endings, because Gabriel's story has several of them in the canonical text. The last time Gabriel speaks in the Gospel of Luke, his words are addressed not to a king or a prophet or a priest, but to a young woman of no particular social standing in an unremarkable village. Luke chapter 1, verses 26 through 38. We have visited this passage at length in an earlier chapter, but I want to return to it now with fresh eyes, from the perspective of the entire story we have told together. After everything, after the terrifying visions in Daniel, after the cosmic scope of the 70 weeks prophecy, after centuries of the richest theological elaboration across 3 world religions, the final canonical image of Gabriel in action is this: a being who stands before God, choosing to speak carefully and gently to a frightened young woman, addressing her fear before her mission, waiting for her question, answering it honestly, and then leaving quietly when the conversation is complete. There is no fanfare in that departure. Luke chapter 1, verse 38 simply says, "The angel left her. He came, he spoke, she answered, he left. The work was done." I find Daniel chapter 9, verse 23. The place where Gabriel calls Daniel highly esteemed, the Hebrew Shamudot, one of the most quietly significant moments in Gabriel's entire canonical story. And I want to return to it now because of what it says about the relationship between the divine and the human that runs underneath all of Gabriel's appearances. The word shamudo carries the sense of being precious, being greatly desired or valued, being regarded with something close to tenderness. It appears only twice in the book of Daniel as a direct address, in chapter 9 and in chapter 10. And both times it is used of the same human being, a man who has spent his life in exile, who has navigated the courts of foreign empires, who has held on to his faith in circumstances that offered him every reason to let it go. Gabriel, standing in the presence of God, carrying messages from the center of all things to the edge of one frightened human life, calls this man precious. I think that word carries everything that Gabriel's story is ultimately about. The divine communication Gabriel carries is never impersonal. It is always addressed to someone who is known, regarded, cared for, someone the divine world has noticed and found worthy of a message. Now I want to say something about Mary's response in Luke chapter 1, verse 38. Because I think it is the human side of everything Gabriel's story has been building toward. I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled. These are the last human words addressed to Gabriel in the canonical biblical text. They are spoken by the youngest and least socially powerful of all the people Gabriel visits. A young woman in a Roman-occupied province, in a village of no consequence, with no institutional religious role, no political standing, no academic credential. And what she says is this: I belong to the one who sent you. Let it happen as you have said. The biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann, in his Theology of the Old Testament, speaks of what he calls the persistent divine initiative toward human beings. The way the canonical story, across both testaments, it is driven by God's movement toward people, rather than by people's movement toward God. Gabriel is the most concentrated expression of that initiative in the entire canonical text, and Mary's response is the most complete expression of the human answer that initiative calls for. Not passive resignation, but active, voiced, personal assent. I belong to this. Let it be. There is something I want to share with you about the way Gabriel's name has traveled across languages and civilizations, because it speaks to the remarkable persistence of this figure across the most profound cultural changes. In Hebrew, he is Gabriel, Gavriel. In Greek, he is Gavriel, Gabriel. In Latin, Gabriel, spelled exactly as we spell it today. In Arabic, Jibreel, Jibreel. The sounds shift slightly across the transliteration of the name into different writing systems and phonetic traditions, but the name itself remains recognizably the same across 3,000 years of linguistic change. That linguistic persistence is, I think, a small but significant sign of something larger. The way this figure has remained present and recognizable across transformations that destroyed most of the cultural structures of the ancient world. Empires fell, languages died, religions divided and subdivided. Civilizations rose and collapsed and were succeeded by others. And through all of it, the name Gabriel continued to be spoken in synagogues and churches and mosques and homes by people who found in this messenger's story something that their own story needed. Let me reflect on what I believe Gabriel's story ultimately tells us about the enduring human need that keeps it alive. Across every tradition we have explored, the canonical biblical text, 1st Enoch, the Talmud and Midrash, the Kabbalistic tradition, the Islamic Hadith and Quran, the Eastern Orthodox icons, the Catholic feast days, the Ethiopian monthly commemorations, Gabriel represents the conviction that the distance between the divine and the human is not absolute, that it can be crossed, that something can travel from the place where all things originate to the place where individual human lives are actually lived, and not just travel, but arrive, actually reach the specific, frightened, overwhelmed human being who is lying prostrate on the ground, or shaking in the holy place, or sitting troubled and thinking in a small room in Galilee. The world has always had plenty of evidence that the divine and the human are separated by a gulf too wide to cross. The armies of Nebuchadnezzar, the silence of 400 years, the barrenness of Elizabeth, the smallness of Nazareth. All of it is evidence that the universe does not organize itself around human need or human hope. And yet, into every one of those situations, Gabriel arrives, carrying something from somewhere beyond the silence. I want to be honest with you, as I have tried to be throughout this entire story, about the place where Gabriel's narrative leaves us in the canonical text. He does not appear in the book of Revelation, despite the popular assumption that he does. The 7 angels of Revelation, chapter 8, verse 2, are unnamed in the canonical text. They are not identified as Gabriel, and presenting that identification as biblical would be inaccurate. Gabriel's canonical story ends in Luke chapter 1, in a small room in Nazareth, with a young woman's quiet and world-altering yes. After that, the canonical text is silent about him. He does not appear at the resurrection, or at Pentecost, or in any of the letters of Paul, or in the book of Revelation. He completed what he was sent to do, and the text lets him rest in that completion. I find something genuinely beautiful about that silence. It is consistent with everything the text has shown us about Gabriel's character. He is not a figure who seeks to remain in the story longer than his mission requires. He comes when he is sent. He speaks what he has been given to say, and then he goes. There is one final theological reflection I want to offer you, drawn from across the entire tradition we have explored together, and it is perhaps the most personal thing I have said in all of these chapters. Gabriel's story, at its deepest level, is a story about the relationship between eternity and the present moment. Gabriel stands before God, in whatever that means, in whatever kind of existence that describes, and then he is sent into the most specific, most time-bound, most immediate kind of human situation. Daniel's confusion beside a canal in Persia, an old priest's once-in-a-lifetime moment in the holy place, a young woman's ordinary day in a small village. The eternal touches the immediate, not through some grand cosmic mechanism, but through a messenger who stands before God and then walks through a door. And what that messenger carries across that vast distance is not power, not judgment, not demonstration of force. It is understanding. It is the removal of fear. It is the announcement that someone known and valued by the divine world is receiving a specific message intended specifically for them. That is what Gabriel has always carried, and I think that is why his story keeps being told. Tonight, as you settle into the deepest rest, let Gabriel's story release you into peace, rather than keeping you alert with more to process. We have traveled together through everything the ancient texts and traditions have to say about this messenger. His name, his world, his appearances in Daniel, his silence-breaking arrival in Luke, his role in Jewish mysticism and rabbinic story, his extraordinary status as Jibreel in Islam, his journey through the history of art and devotion and theological reflection, and finally the deep philosophical questions about what kind of being he actually is and what his story means for the rest of us. What remains, after all of that, is something simple, a name that means God is my strength, a being who stands before God and is sent toward human beings, a messenger who begins every encounter by addressing fear, a story without a monument, told by billions of people across thousands of years, in languages Gabriel himself may never have spoken, to hearts that keep finding, in his brief, canonical appearances, something they needed to hear. The word was given, the messenger carried it. The message arrived, and somewhere in the quiet that follows every act of genuine communication, something changed. Rest now. The story is complete, and you have heard it all the way to the end.